Hello, and welcome to this clean historical Western romance by Martha Gillcrest. It's great to have you with us. Before we begin, be sure to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple way allows us to share more heartwarming romance stories with you for free. Now, get cozy, relax, and escape into adventure and love with a host of new characters. Enjoy. The following book is the copyright of Martha Gillcrest. The Widow's Wish by Martha Gillcrest. Chapter 1. Boston, Massachusetts, 1879. Hazel paused for a moment, her arms still plunged into the hot water she was using to wash the dishes. A wave of nausea passed over her, and she took a deep breath and squeezed her eyes closed, waiting for it to pass. "Are you feeling any better today?" her younger sister, Laura, asked as she came into the kitchen. Her pretty face was creased with concern as she placed the folded laundry on the table. Hazel opened her eyes and nodded after a moment's hesitation. "Getting there, slowly," she said wearily. "When are you going to tell Papa?" Laura asked, lowering her voice with a furtive glance toward the hallway. Hazel dried her hands on her apron and bustled over to the large range, where a saucepan of soup was simmering gently. She bit her lip, not sure how to answer. It should have been a joyful time for her, finding out that she was expecting her first baby. But her papa's behavior had been increasingly erratic over the last few months, which had cast a dark cloud over the Anderson household. She didn't know why or even how to help him, but it played on her mind day and night. It had gotten to the stage that she barely recognized Edward Anderson, the respected businessman of Boston, as so many knew him, but to her, their loving father. She couldn't pinpoint it on losing her beloved mama, as that had happened 5 years ago in childbirth. But he had turned from being a temperate man into someone who drank almost every night in the privacy of his study and was now quick to lose his temper at the slightest thing. "I'm not sure," she muttered, pushing a lock of her honey-blonde hair back from her forehead. "I was thinking I might cook his favorite dinner of baked ham and vegetables and then tell him afterward." Laura nodded. "That sounds like a good idea." She rubbed Hazel's shoulder affectionately as she passed. At 22 years old, Hazel bore the brunt of their father's demands and mercurial moods. But Laura had overheard enough to know that Hazel would need to choose her time carefully to tell their pa that she was with child. He didn't like change, and it often seemed that no matter what Hazel did, he was never satisfied. "I haven't even had a chance to tell Zachary yet," Hazel added. "Let's hope he's home soon then." "He's due back any day, but I'm not sure exactly when. He didn't tell me where he was traveling to this time." Hazel could hear the boys waking upstairs. 8-year-old Frank and 5-year-old Paul. Along with Laura, her younger brothers were the light of her life, and she smiled at the thought of the whirlwind of energy and inquisitiveness they brought to each day. "Can you get the boys ready for school, Laura?" "I'm not sure I have the energy for it this morning. I've made porridge for them, but Pa asked me to make a special dinner for this evening as he's entertaining." Laura rolled her eyes. "Not Miss Neal, I hope?" They shared a conspiratorial smile as Hazel nodded. "I'm afraid so. I'd better tell the boys they must be on their best behavior." She hurried away, and Hazel couldn't help but wish their pa was entertaining at one of the restaurants he favored instead of at home, where she would be doing all the work. Winifred Neal was a wealthy spinster with a liking for gossip, whose beady eyes missed nothing. Hazel decided she had better wear her blue dress. The draped cut of the fabric hid the slight swell of her belly well, and Hazel had already decided she didn't want anyone to know about the baby until she'd had a chance to tell Zachary, her errant husband. Zachary Walker? Hazel sighed as her thoughts drifted back over the last 6 months since meeting him. She reached for the wooden chopping board to start preparing apples to make a pie for dessert, and an image of his aquiline features and dark eyes slid into her mind. So handsome, but not the reliable, attentive man she had first thought him to be, she was sadly coming to realize. They had gotten married 5 months ago, after a whirlwind romance. He was the first man who had ever paid her any attention in a romantic sense, meeting her when he had picked up her glove, which she had dropped when she was out buying vegetables one day. "A beautiful young lady like you shouldn't have to carry this heavy basket," he had said, giving her an intense stare that left her feeling flustered and breathless in a most disconcerting manner. After introducing himself, Zachary had insisted on carrying her heavy basket, regaling her with amusing stories until they reached the corner of the street where Hazel lived with her family. She remembered how courteous he had been, especially how impressed he had been when he realized she lived in such an elegant home, telling her that once he'd made his fortune, he too hoped to live in a house just like that. Hazel had wanted the walk home to last forever as she basked in his attention. So when he had politely asked if he might visit to take tea with her and returned 2 days later with a box of fine cigars for her papa and a bunch of hothouse flowers for her, it seemed like a foregone conclusion that they would fall head over heels in love. And now I'm having a baby with a man I feel like I barely know. Hazel's hand stilled for a moment as a new thought occurred to her. Perhaps Zachary will want to change jobs so he can be home more often if he knows about the baby, she murmured to herself. A tentative smile lifted her mouth as she realized this could change everything. Zachary worked as a traveling representative for a tea importing business. At least, she thought he did. He was always rather vague about what his work actually entailed. All Hazel knew was that it took him away so much. He had been more than happy to suggest that it would be better for Hazel to continue to live in her pa's elegantly proportioned family home for the time being. "I've almost saved up enough to get our own place, Hazel," he had said between kisses that left her feeling dizzy with delight. "But I don't want you to be lonesome when I'm away visiting customers, and your pa seems happier to have you living at home." Thinking back to the conversation, Hazel shook her head slightly. Of course, her pa had agreed to them starting married life with her still living at home and Zachary just staying with her on the rare occasions he was in Boston. It meant that he still had his eldest daughter under his thumb, exactly where he liked her, acting as cook, housekeeper, nanny, and more. Hazel had harbored dreams of becoming a teacher, but when her ma had died, Edward had been quick to tell her she might as well forget all about it. He needed her to care for her siblings. As much as she loved Frank and Paul, Hazel sometimes wondered whether she would ever have a life of her own. But now Zachary and I can get a house together, maybe just around the corner, so I can still see the boys and Laura, she thought to herself. She weighed out the flour and butter to make the crumbly short crust pastry she knew her pa liked best, feeling more cheerful than she had in days. All she needed was for Zachary to come home so she could tell him their good news, and the next stage of their marriage would be all set. Surely Pa could get Zachary a good job in Boston with his connections, she pondered, as she rubbed the butter and flour together with her fingertips. As if summoned by her thoughts, the kitchen door suddenly swung open, and Hazel turned to see her handsome husband standing in the doorway. "Zachary, you're home! How long are you staying, my love?" Hazel hastily wiped her hands and blushed as he strode toward her and brushed a perfunctory kiss on her cheek. He seemed distracted, but she figured he was just tired. "I can't stay more than today," Zachary replied. "Can you fix me up a cooked breakfast? I have to head straight out to meet the bank manager." "You should have told me you were back in Boston," Hazel said lightly, trying to conceal her disappointment. "I would have made a special meal for you. Are you sure you can't stay longer?" "Don't nag, Hazel." Zachary flopped into a chair and drummed his fingers on the table while she hastily put thick rashers of bacon into a pan for him. "Is your father up?" he asked. "No, not yet. He had a late night in his study." Hazel didn't want to mention the empty whiskey bottle she had found. If Edward was sleeping in late, the last thing she wanted was to wake him up early and suffer his inevitable bad temper. "That's inconvenient. He said he was going to loan me some money for a business investment." Zachary's mouth pinched with irritation, and he stood up again, pacing around the kitchen. "I really was relying on getting it today, Hazel. What time will he be up?" "I'm not sure." Hazel slipped her arms around his waist and rested her head against his chest, wishing he would stop talking about business just for a moment. She could hear Laura trying to get the boys ready quietly upstairs and decided to seize the moment. Zachary could be away for weeks again. She couldn't afford to wait for the perfect time. "I have some news, my love." Hazel said softly. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him to make sure she had his attention. Uh-huh, Zachary said absent-mindedly. He peered over her head into the hallway as if hoping that his father-in-law might be up after all. I haven't been feeling very well, so I saw the doctor last week, and he said I'm with child. We'll have our first baby by next spring, Zachary. Isn't that wonderful? Zachary pulled away from her abruptly. A baby? Are you sure? He looked startled, but not in a good way. Hazel felt tears of disappointment burning at the back of her eyes and blinked them away. Yes, the doctor was very sure, she said, giving him a tremulous smile. I know we never talked much about having a family, but you said you'd be able to buy a house for us shortly. I figured this would be the perfect time for you to change jobs, Zachary. I'm sure Pa would be able to find you something better right here in Boston, so you won't have to travel away all the time anymore. I like my job, Hazel. Why on earth would I want to change it? I thought I'd made it clear I didn't want to have children yet. Zachary's tone was sharp, and his dark eyes were cold. It was so far from the tender moment Hazel had pictured that she was momentarily lost for words. I thought you'd be happy. You thought I'd be happy, huh? Perhaps you should let me be the judge of that. Zachary ran a hand through his hair, looking agitated, but then suddenly relented and gave her a warm smile. I'm sorry, Hazel. Don't mind me. Of course, I'm happy, delighted, in fact. I've just had a few things on my mind. Oh, Zachary, thank you, Hazel said with a gasp of relief. I couldn't bear for you not to want us to have a family together. You know how much I love children. I tell you what, how about I spend the night here before heading off again tomorrow? Hazel nodded gratefully. She had the meal to prepare for her father and Miss Neal, but perhaps her pa would like Zachary to join them too, so they could talk about business matters. That would be wonderful, she said happily. I really do need to sort this investment out today, Zachary replied. He pulled Hazel closer and pressed a kiss to her mouth, which made her heart leap with hope for the future. Does your pa keep any money in the house, Hazel? He continued lightly. I wouldn't ask usually, but we have the baby to think of now. He grinned and shook his head in disbelief. I want us to have our own house, nothing but the best for my Hazel and our children. So you'll take a job in Boston? Sure, just let me tie up a few loose ends first. Zachary gave her a heart-melting smile and kissed her again. You're right. It's time for me to work locally instead of traveling all the time so we can be together every day. Pa does keep some money in his study, Hazel said slowly. She looked up into her husband's handsome face, wondering whether she was doing the right thing. He said he would be happy to give you a loan, did he? He hasn't mentioned it to me. Zachary nodded eagerly. Of course, in fact, he insisted. He knows I'm a good businessman, Hazel, but it's not the sort of thing he'd want to bother you with. It's just some money to tide me over until someone who owes me for some work pays up. Perhaps I should go upstairs and wake him, just to make sure it's all right to give it to you. Hazel's palms felt clammy at the idea, and her voice sounded doubtful. No need for that, my darling, Zachary exclaimed. If the money is in his study, I can have everything done by lunchtime, and then perhaps I could treat you to a new gown. We could go to the dressmaker together, and you can choose whatever fabric you want. Let your pa sleep in a little longer. I know you prefer it that way. Besides, he's going to do very nicely out of this investment too, he added, giving Hazel a persuasive smile. Before Hazel could reply, Frank and Paul came rushing into the kitchen, charging toward her like a pair of exuberant puppies. We never knew you were coming home, Uncle Zachary, they cried. Are you staying to have breakfast with us? Not today, boys, but I'll eat dinner with you tonight and tell you about my latest trip, shall I? Frank grabbed 2 bowls off the dresser, and Hazel brought the porridge to the table. She could sense Zachary's impatience beneath this jovial exterior by the way he kept glancing at the clock on the mantel shelf. If you look in the bottom drawer of Pa's desk in his study, you'll see the money there, and you can take the amount you agreed, she murmured to him. The boys are already in trouble for being late to school this week because I wasn't feeling well. Zachary tenderly brushed her cheek with his thumb. You're going to make a wonderful mother, Hazel, he said softly. I'll go now and be back before you know it. Frank had more sugar on his porridge than I did, Paul grumbled behind them at the table. Did not. I can't wait for us to take a walk through town to the dressmaker's later, Hazel said quietly. I've missed you so much, Zachary. Having this baby is going to be a whole new start for us, a better life together. It sure is, Zachary exclaimed. His eyes were bright with enthusiasm as he pulled his coat back on and hurried away to his father-in-law's study. But deep in her heart, Hazel couldn't help but wonder if his excitement was over her news of the precious new life growing in her, or the thrill of another business deal. Chapter 2. Boston, Massachusetts, 1879. This is very charming, Winifred Neal said, smiling warmly at Edward as he ushered her into the dining room. Hazel had just finished lighting the candles and putting the finishing touches to a vase of flowers on the sideboard. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the lamplight cast a soft glow over the best silverware which adorned the table. It's worth it to enjoy your company, Miss Neal, Edward replied with a chuckle. He pulled a chair out and helped her sit down. You can serve the food now, Hazel, he added briskly. Oh, I didn't see you in the shadows there, Winifred exclaimed. Her gaze lingered on Hazel with a thoughtful expression before turning back to her host. How are you, Edward? I'm glad to be back in Boston after a month staying with my sister. I'll be back with the soup in just a moment, Hazel said hastily. She wondered briefly whether her pa would tell their guest that the room looked so charming because of her hard work, but then dismissed the thought. Perhaps in the past he would have done so, but not now. What about a drink for Miss Neal? Edward shot back. Do I have to do everything myself? He added with a frown. No, of course not. I'm sorry. The glasses on the tray rattled as Hazel poured out some homemade lemonade for Miss Neal and wine for her pa. There was something about Winifred's prying eyes that made her all fingers and thumbs, and she prayed that the dress and her apron would conceal her secret. Winifred winced as some of the lemonade splashed out of the glass onto her linen napkin as Hazel put the drinks on the table. Goodness me, do be careful. This is my best dress. She shot Hazel a suspicious look. My married friends tell me that being with child can make a woman as clumsy as a cart horse, she added with a tinkling laugh. With child? Edward spluttered. Is this true, Hazel? He demanded. Are you expecting a baby? Hazel's cheeks burned with embarrassment, and she gave a small nod of confirmation. When exactly were you going to tell me this important news? If Hazel had hoped her pa might be pleased, she quickly realized it was a fool's dream. Edward's expression was stony, and Winifred's small eyes gleamed with pleasure at the chance of being able to cast Hazel in a poor light. I didn't want to say anything until I'd had a chance to tell. Zachary, Hazel said quietly. She clasped her hands in front of her stomach in an unconsciously defensive gesture. The doctor only confirmed it last week, she added. I see. And who exactly will carry out the housekeeping duties and look after Frank and Paul when you get too tired and distracted by this baby of yours? I suppose you expect me to hire a new housekeeper, cook, and nanny, do you? No, Pa. I'll carry on doing everything, of course. Hazel thought longingly about her ma, who would have been overjoyed about the baby. She was tempted to reply that if that was her pa's biggest concern, he might now understand that she had been doing the work of 3 people for nothing more than the roof over her head these last 5 years. But she bit the words back. As if your dear father doesn't have enough on his plate, being such an important businessman, Winifred remarked, stoking the flames of Edward's disapproval. Does Zachary know about this yet? Edward asked bluntly. I haven't seen the man for weeks. He called by briefly this morning, Hazel said. She lifted her chin defiantly. He is delighted that he's going to be a father. And of course, we are looking forward to having our own house together just as soon as he finalizes some of his business affairs. Hazel edged toward the door, hoping that the soup wouldn't be burning. What do you mean? Having your own house together? Edward asked indignantly. He lifted his hand to stop her from leaving the room. Hazel hesitated and turned back to face him. She had been beside herself with worry all day because, in spite of his promises to come back to the house as quickly as he could and take Hazel out to treat her to a new gown, she hadn't seen Zachary since breakfast. He will have just gotten caught up with his business acquaintances. He'll be back any moment. That's what she had been telling herself all day, but now it was almost nightfall, and worry was clawing at her chest. She decided to take a different tack with her pa. "You're so well regarded in Boston. I was hoping that you might be able to help Zachary find a new job based in town, so he can be home every day instead of traveling away for weeks on end," Hazel replied. "Well, that would be a start," Edward muttered reluctantly. He caught Winifred smiling at him and relaxed again. "You're right. I am well thought of in town. I'm sure I could ask around." Hazel's heart lifted slightly, and she decided to capitalize on the fact that he couldn't get into one of his rages with Miss Neal sitting next to him. "Zachary said he has almost saved up enough money for us to buy a house here in Boston," she explained. "I'll make sure we're living as close to here as possible, and I expect I'll still be able to come by every day and look after the boys. You know how much I care for them." "I think that's the least you can do for your pa," Miss Neal commented, taking a sip of her lemonade. "Good servants can be hard to come by, but I'd be more than happy to help you, Edward, if you need to hire someone." Edward sat back in his chair and took a gulp of his wine. Something was still bothering him. "How does your husband intend to buy a house in this neighborhood?" he asked, looking puzzled. "I doubt if his job pays that well, which is why I never approved of you marrying him in the first place, Hazel. Zachary is a very astute businessman, as well as the work he does for the tea company," Hazel shot back without thinking. "You know he is. That's why you agreed to loan him the money for his latest investment. Zachary said that this will be his biggest deal yet, and that he'll make more than enough money from it to buy a house for us. He said you'll be making good money from it, too," she added. She felt out of her depth and wished again that her husband was there to explain it all better than she could. She had always known he dabbled in business deals alongside his proper job, but it was another thing he had always preferred to keep her in the dark about. "I never agreed to any loan," Edward barked. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly on the polished floor. "What are you talking about, Hazel? Is your mind addled because of the baby?" Hazel felt a sickening lurch in her stomach at her father's words. "Zachary told me this morning that you had agreed to loan him the money for the investment," she stuttered. "Is he still in Boston? When's he getting back so I can find out what on earth is going on?" "He only stayed for an hour this morning, Papa. He said it was urgent to do the deal today and that he would be back as soon as it was done, but he's not home yet." Hazel's words trailed off as she realized how implausible everything suddenly sounded the way she was describing it. Edward's face darkened with anger. "Did you give him any of my money?" Hazel nodded mutely, stumbling backward against the sideboard as Edward strode past her toward his study. "I didn't want to bother you, Pa," she cried at his retreating back. "You were still asleep, and Zachary said there was no time to lose. I'm sure he only took a small amount, and he would have agreed on it with you if you'd been awake." Again, she bit her tongue about the fact that Edward had only slept late because of drinking a bottle of whiskey the night before. She knew how cross he would get if there was any implication he was at fault. A moment later, there was a roar of anger from Edward's study, and he came running back into the dining room. "Do you realize how much he took?" He named the amount, and Hazel gasped with shock. It was far more than she would ever have imagined. She'd had no idea her pa kept so much money in his study. "I'm sure he's just gotten waylaid with work. Let me serve dinner for you and Miss Neal, and I expect Zachary will be back any moment now." "Try not to worry about it," Winifred said, patting Edward's chair. "Sit down and have a drop more wine. You can ask him all about it when he comes back. I've been so looking forward to our dinner together. It would be a shame to spoil the evening fretting about such a trifling amount of money." Hazel slipped out into the hallway and headed for the kitchen, glad to escape. For once, she was grateful for Miss Neal's presence, although she was startled that the woman would consider that sum of money a trifling amount. She knew Winifred was a woman of means, but she was clearly wealthier than she had thought. By the time Hazel was carrying the warm apple pie through to the dining room to serve dessert, her head was aching with anxiety about where Zachary had gotten to. He often mentioned having numerous business connections, both in Boston and in all the large towns along the east coast of America, where his work took him. But she had never actually met any of his friends or acquaintances. Whenever she asked him about it, he always brushed her questions away, telling her there was plenty of time to get around to that. He would whisk her into his arms and explain that because he was in Boston so infrequently, he wanted to keep her all to himself. To start with, Hazel had found his reasons endearing, but now, as the night drew on, she regretted not pressing him to meet some of his acquaintances. "I don't know where he is, and there's not a single friend or work colleague of his I've met who might know." It was a sobering thought, and she felt her worries increase, making her feel slightly lightheaded. "Try not to worry about it," Laura kept whispering every time Hazel returned to the kitchen. "It's not good for the baby." "Does your husband normally stay out this late?" Miss Neal asked curiously as she poured cream over her apple pie. "I thought he would want to be by your side, having just found out that you're with child." Hazel was determined not to let Winifred's barbed comment get to her. "Perhaps he's celebrating with his business acquaintances over a successful deal." Hazel sent up a silent prayer that this was the case as she returned to the kitchen. There was just the coffee to make and serve, and then mercifully the evening would be over, and she would be left to her own thoughts. And hopefully, Zachary will be back by then, and will be laughing about me worrying over nothing. A loud hammering on the front door stopped her in her tracks in the long hallway, and her mouth went dry. It sounded urgent. She spun around and rushed to the door, turning the handle with trembling fingers. "Is this the Anderson household?" The constable standing on the doorstep took his hat off and looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. The lamp by the door cast shadows on his face, and a moth bumped against the glass, intent on getting to the light. "Yes, this is my pa's house. Mr. Edward Anderson. Can I help you?" "It's best I speak with the man of the house," the constable said pompously, stepping into the hallway without being invited. Edward appeared in the dining room doorway with a questioning look on his face. "What do you want?" he demanded irritably. "I've had so many interruptions this evening. It's enough to give me indigestion." "Are you Mr. Edward Anderson, sir?" the constable asked, seemingly unperturbed by Edward's annoyance. He pulled a piece of paper out of his greatcoat and held it out between them. Hazel craned forward to see what it was, and was surprised to realize it was a letter from the bank her pa used. She recognized the gold-embossed emblem at the top of the page and her father's distinctive signature in black ink at the bottom. "I am Mr. Anderson. May I ask why you are holding a private document of mine in your grubby hands, constable? Do you know I'm good friends with people in high office in this town?" The constable coughed awkwardly, becoming more deferential. "We found this document tucked inside the coat pocket of a gentleman not an hour ago. He'd been beaten up and left in the gutter behind one of the gambling saloons in a rough neighborhood. Have you any thoughts about why he would have had this on him, sir?" Edward snatched the piece of paper off him. "I have no idea." "What did the gentleman look like?" Hazel asked faintly. Her heart hammered painfully in her chest, and she almost didn't want to hear the answer. "Tall, about 5 years older than you, with a small scar under the right side of his chin." Hazel grabbed the sideboard as her head started to spin. "That's Zachary, my husband," she gasped. "Is he all right? I must see him immediately. Is there a doctor with him now, tending to his wounds?" This time, the constable's expression was all too easy to read. He looked at Hazel with pity in his eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I guess I should have made it clearer. Your husband is dead, beaten up by some of the unsavory characters who frequent that saloon, no doubt. All he had on him was this piece of paper, which is how I knew to come to this address." "Dead? I don't understand. Why would Zachary be in a neighborhood like that?" Hazel shook her head, wishing that the constable would shrug his shoulders and tell her it had all been a mistake, that someone else had died, not her husband. "I don't understand why he had this piece of paper from my bank," Edward continued, almost as if he hadn't heard that Zachary was dead or noticed the tears, which were now rolling down Hazel's cheeks unchecked. "We made a few inquiries, but nobody was willing to say much," the constable muttered. The most we got was from one of the drunks, who claimed that this Zachary fella was calling himself Edward Anderson and trying to make himself out to be someone important. Something to do with a business deal gone wrong, the drunk reckoned. Although I'm not sure I would place too much faith in his description, sir. The witness was halfway through a bottle of whiskey, after all. Hazel, what's wrong? Laura came running into the hallway just as Frank and Paul appeared at the top of the stairs, sleepily rubbing their eyes. Pa, why is Hazel upset? It's Zachary, he's dead. Fresh tears streamed down Hazel's cheeks as Laura embraced her. Who will take care of the baby and me now? She wailed as she realized all her dreams for a happy future had turned to dust. Chapter 3. Rocky River, Wyoming, 1879. Pa, what time will you be home tonight? John Fisher felt the usual pang of guilt as his 6-year-old daughter, Emily, trailed behind him, watching him as he loaded his carpentry tools into the back of their small wagon. Emily's tousled, dark curls and serious expression sometimes reminded him of his late wife, Zoe, so much that it took his breath away. I promise I'll try to get home earlier tonight, John said. He scooped her up and sat her on the back of the wagon, where she swung her legs happily. This job at the Rosebush Inn is kind of important, and I don't want to let Eli down, he explained. He knew his daughter didn't really understand, and he didn't want to burden her with the details of needing to make enough money to pay Mrs. Bell, his housekeeper. Emily was already too serious for his liking. Trying too hard to be a grown-up when she should have been free just to enjoy her childhood. Can I come to work with you today, Pa? 4-year-old Reuben burst out of the front door of their log cabin and charged down the veranda steps with their dog Spot at his side. He had a smudge of dirt on his face, and his hair was tangled. His sturdy legs were too short for him to reach the wagon, but he didn't let that stop him as he tried to scramble up next to his sister. Not today, son, John said with a tinge of regret. Mrs. Bell will be here any minute to look after you, but you could pass me those tools if you want to help me. The sound of the gate in the picket fence clicking told him she had already arrived, and he felt the usual wave of mixed emotions at her presence. Gratitude that she had agreed to look after his children so he could go to work, but also regret that she had to be there at all. This wasn't how he'd imagined his life when he'd settled at Rocky River. It was meant to be where he and Zoe would grow old together, raising children, then welcoming grandchildren. But instead, he was a widower before the age of 30, wondering why fate had cruelly taken Zoe from them too soon. The sharp edge of his grief had dulled over time, but only to be replaced with an ache of loneliness that felt like an unwanted shadow he could never shake off. Come along, children, Mrs. Bell said crisply. There's no time to be dawdling around outside with your pa. He needs to get to work, and you need to wash that face, Reuben. What have I told you about wasting time playing in the dirt before breakfast? She added. Emily, you can help me make breakfast, and then it will be time for school. Everything about Mrs. Bell radiated impatience. From the clack of her boots, walking briskly up the path, to the way she continuously glanced at the clock on the mantel and chivied the children to follow her well-oiled routine. Her efficiency was what had persuaded John to employ her. Goodness knows he needed some sort of order in his family's life, but he wondered whether it had come at the cost of allowing the children time to, well, just be children. What she called dawdling and wasting time, John liked to think of as moments to watch the birds flying over or enjoy daydreaming. He liked nothing more than sketching out ideas for his wood carving, and he had already seen glimmers of creativity in his children. But Mrs. Bell didn't believe in letting the mind wander. Do we have to go inside already, Pa? Emily whispered. I sometimes feel like Mrs. Bell is cross with us, and I don't know why. She's not cross with you, John said hastily. That's just her manner, and I want you to do as she says. He felt wretched as Emily's face fell, but he couldn't afford to lose Mrs. Bell. It had already taken 3 unsuitable housekeepers to find her, and although she could be sharp, he knew her heart was in the right place. Maybe it's because she's lonesome after losing her husband, John added. Emily nodded with a small frown. I'm sorry, Pa. I didn't think of that. I'll make sure we do what she wants. How about we go to the park for a picnic by the river this weekend? He suggested, smiling as Emily's face lit up at the idea. Work had become such a priority that he realized he hadn't done anything just for fun with his children for a while. Everything had been so much easier when Zoe was still alive. Between picnics, visiting friends and neighbors, and joining in with community events in town, Zoe had always made sure they had something to look forward to. But somehow, he didn't have the heart for it since she had died giving birth to Reuben 4 years earlier. He knew he had become set in his ways, working every hour possible, and something had to change. A picnic? Yes, please, Reuben cried, grabbing Emily's hand, and we can go fishing too. They skipped up the path toward the log cabin, already looking forward to the rare treat of an outing. Hurry up, children, for goodness sake. Mrs. Bell had appeared on the veranda again with a scowl on her face. You need to come and do your chores. The Lord does not like idle hands, or children who don't do as they're told. I'll have a stew made for tonight, she added, looking at John. Thank you, Mrs. Bell. I appreciate your help. John raised his hands and waved goodbye to them, thankful to see her expression soften somewhat. He had discovered that as long as he thanked her every day, she was more tolerant of the times when he was running late getting home in the evenings. But it was a tricky tightrope to walk, keeping her happy. At least you're not so complicated, John murmured, patting the neck of his beloved horse, Clyde. The muscular gelding flicked his ears at the attention from his master and pawed the ground, eager to get going. Let's go, boy. John jumped up onto the seat of the wagon and picked up his reins with one final glance into the wagon to make sure he had everything he needed. The early morning sun was warm on his face as Clyde trotted along the track. He knew the route so well that it gave John plenty of time to look around at his block of land with a sense of satisfaction. He had a couple of modest barns and a corral next to the homestead, and a small herd of prime cattle to supplement his income as a carpenter. It was the opportunity to own land in the majestic rolling hills on the edge of town that had first drawn him to head west to Rocky River 10 years ago. He had persuaded Zoe this was where their future lay, instead of the cramped streets of Five Points, New York, and they had set off with nothing more than 2 bags of belongings and a determination to have a better way of life for themselves and their children. Before John had a chance to get lost in his memories of the past, a sudden shout caught his attention. Howdy, John. How are you doing? It was Ray Manning, their immediate neighbor, and John groaned inwardly at the sight of him standing at the end of the track where both their properties met. Good morning, Ray, John said, raising a hand in greeting. Sorry, I can't stop to chat. Eli and Suzanne want me to finish the work at the Rosebush as soon as possible. You should learn to take life a bit easier, Ray said, ignoring John's words. He shambled out in front of John's wagon, swaying slightly from his usual hangover. He was tall and thick-set, and would have been good-looking if he could be bothered to take care of his appearance. Too many years of hard drinking hadn't done him any favors either. Don't suppose you could spare Mrs. Bell for an hour or two sometime, could you? He asked. John tightened the reins and pulled Clyde to a stop. He knew when Ray was in this sort of mood, it was quicker to talk to him and get the conversation out of the way so he could get on with his day. I'm not so sure Mrs. Bell would have time to fit anything else in. I've been working longer hours than usual, and she has her other commitments in the evenings. Church, the sewing circle, you know. Ray coughed up some tobacco-stained phlegm, which he spat on the floor. Surely you could persuade her, he wheedled. I just need her to tidy up my place. It shouldn't take more than a couple of hours. John stifled a snort of incredulity. If Ray thought Mrs. Bell could perform some sort of miracle by turning his squalid shack into something resembling a clean and tidy home within a couple of hours, he had clearly been drinking more whiskey than usual. Having Ray Manning as a neighbor was the only downside of where they lived. He had moved in not long after Zoe and John had bought their plot of land, and John had never warmed to him. Ray was lazy and deceitful. 2 characteristics John hated the most in folk. What do you find so amusing? Ray grumbled. His eyes were bloodshot, and John could smell the stench of stale alcohol even from where he sat in his wagon. Just wondering why you want to tidy your place up after all this time is all, John replied lightly. He knew better than to antagonize Ray. He had seen him often enough, stumbling out of the saloons in Rocky River, in the company of folks he knew who had no regard for the law, to get into any sort of argument with him. "Why not?" Ray gave him a sly smile. "I know you think you're better than me, John, but maybe you've got me all wrong. I'm not just a trapper anymore," he added, thrusting his chin out argumentatively. "Folks are going to see me in a whole new light soon enough," he mumbled cryptically. "Not just Ray with his stinky old furs, but a businessman to be reckoned with." "That sounds intriguing. Are you doing something different from trapping now?" John's interest was piqued in spite of himself. He wondered what crazy scheme Ray had gotten himself embroiled in now, and whether it was legal. "Maybe, John, maybe." Ray tapped the side of his nose secretively, and his eyes glinted with greed. "Just pursuing a few new ideas," he said with a chuckle. "I can't say too much about it now, just that things are going to change around here soon enough, but it's a secret." He fell into silence for so long that John wondered if the conversation was over. "I'll be on my way then." "Apart from one thing," Ray continued, rousing himself again. "I can tell you I've decided to get myself a wife, one of those mail-order brides from back east. I figured I could use some company, and it would be convenient to have someone to keep the place clean and put a hot dinner on the table for me every night." John couldn't hide his shock for a second time. Ray had always been quick to brag about not wanting to be tied down by a nagging wife when he could have his pick of any of the ladies of the night at the saloon for a few coins. "A wife? That will certainly be a change," John said hesitantly. "Uh-huh, a buxom woman to keep me warm at night at long last." Ray rubbed his hands together with a lewd wink. John felt sorry for the poor young lady who would end up as Ray's wife. The man's manners were non-existent, and there were rumors that he had spent more than one night in Rocky River's jail after Sheriff Jackson had arrested him for treating the saloon ladies badly. "I guess you'll be pleased to have the company of a kind-hearted woman." "You should try getting a wife yourself," Ray continued, not realizing how tactless his comment sounded. "That's why I want Mrs. Bell to give my place a bit of a spring clean," he added. "Figured I'd better make a good first impression, just until I've gotten my wife under my thumb, if you know what I'm saying." John ignored his last comment. "I have considered getting a mail-order bride now that it's been 4 years since Zoe died. I'm not sure a woman would want to take on another man's children, though." He was surprised to find himself talking about matters of the heart with Ray and wondered briefly whether he had judged his neighbor too harshly. Perhaps all Ray needed was the love of a good woman to help him mend his ways. "The trouble with you is that you're too honest." Ray lounged against the fence and grinned up at John. "Just say in your advertisement that you have your own business and land. The little lady can find out about your children when she gets here. There's no need to say anything about them in your advertisement." "You mean for me to lie about having Emily and Reuben? I wouldn't want to start a marriage in that way." John shook his head. He should have known that Ray was still as deceitful as ever. "It's not really lying. Just keeping a few details back is all. Where's the harm in that?" Ray gestured toward his shack and chuckled. "I said in my advertisement that I'm a man of means with a nice cabin. If my woman complains that it ain't quite true, well, it's too late once she's arrived, isn't it?" He slapped his thigh with a snigger of laughter. "I've already had 3 replies. None of them took my fancy. So I'm going to place another advertisement and see if I get someone better. A nice, purty young woman who wants a new start out west. I can't wait." He rubbed his hands together again. The sound of a horse clopping along the road interrupted them, and John picked up his reins again to continue on his journey. He was surprised to see Ray push himself off the fence and stand up straighter at the sight of the stranger approaching. It wasn't anyone John recognized, and he wondered who would be paying Ray a visit this early in the morning. "Well, I'll be sure and ask Mrs. Bell whether she knows of anyone who could clean for you," John said over his shoulder as his wagon rolled away. "Huh? Oh, sure." Ray seemed distracted. As John turned the corner to head through town, he thought about the idea of having a new wife. He had courted a young lady from Hudsonville for a few months in the hope that it might lead to a cordial marriage, if nothing more. But Miss Wilkinson had eventually admitted that she would prefer to wed a gentleman who had never been married before, rather than become stepmother to Emily and Reuben. Since then, John had all but given up on ever finding a wife again. Until Mrs. Devereux persuaded me otherwise, he thought ruefully. He had been fitting a new front door at Mrs. Devereux's matrimonial agency in town, minding his own business, only to find himself placing an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times after she urged him not to give up on finding a wife. She could be very persuasive, and nobody has been more surprised than him, but he hadn't heard anything back and was starting to think that perhaps he would never find anyone to replace his dear Zoe. The sound of an angry shout snapped John out of his musings about love, and he twisted in his wagon seat to see what was happening. He was surprised to see that the stranger on horseback had stopped at Ray's driveway, and it looked like an argument had sprung up between the two men. John strained to try and hear what they were discussing, with a sense of foreboding, but the wind was carrying their voices in the wrong direction. "That's all we need," he muttered. He wondered whether it might be worth calling in to see Sheriff Jackson to let him know that some sort of conflict might be brewing. Ray's idle nature and desire to make money without doing any work meant he attracted trouble like moths to a flame. And John certainly didn't want it landing on his doorstep. He had more than enough to be getting on with, raising his children, and hoping for a quiet life. Chapter 4. Rocky River, Wyoming, 1879. Ray scowled as he tipped the last few drops of whiskey out of the bottle into his mouth. He had drunk most of it the night before, but the last mouthful helped to steady his nerves, which he sure did need. He slumped lower into the rickety chair on his veranda, watching the stranger ride away into the distance through narrowed eyes. "It's not as if what I was doing is so bad," he mumbled to himself. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more offended he became by the stranger's visit. Who does he think he is, coming to my home and telling me what to do? He stood up again, finding it difficult to keep still. Flies buzzed around a rotting carcass at the side of his cabin, and he scowled again. It would soon be time to go out trapping again, if he was going to have enough money to pay for food and a few comforts at the saloon. But the thought of getting all his supplies ready to spend a week or more out hunting put him in even more of a bad mood. It felt too much like hard work these days if he was being honest with himself. "Coffee is what I need. Something to clear my head so I can think straight." His scrawny dog, Bruno, yelped as Ray booted him out of the way and wrenched the cabin door open. He ignored the food-encrusted plates and piles of rubbish in the corners, carelessly sloshing water into his rusty coffee pot and slamming it onto the top of his stove. As he waited for the coffee to warm up, his thoughts drifted back to the unexpected turn his life had taken over the last few months. It had all started when an old acquaintance of his, Marty Hawkins, had shown up at the Black Crow Saloon one night. He knew Marty from way back, but hadn't seen him for years. And they had soon gotten talking, just like old times, as the whiskey flowed. Ray remembered how delighted he had been that Marty had bought all the drinks that night. Far from being the down-at-heel drifter that he remembered, Marty seemed to have more money than he knew what to do with. "What's your secret?" Ray had finally asked him, giving him a bleary grin as it approached midnight. "You're not short of money, but I still don't know what you've been doing with yourself all these years." Marty had leaned forward and lowered his voice. "It's easy enough to make money when you know how," he had said with a furtive smile. "Come on then, for old time's sake, tell me what you're doing," Ray had begged. "I could use some good luck, and you seem to have everything figured out." Marty had looked over his shoulder to make sure they wouldn't be overheard, and Ray remembered feeling a thrill of anticipation at discovering his old friend's secret. He was sick of scraping by to keep a roof over his head, spending weeks away in the middle of nowhere just to earn a few coins for whatever animals he managed to hunt. He was ready for an easier life, and he figured he deserved it. "You travel all over the place, don't you?" Marty had murmured. "Yeah, unfortunately. I wish I didn't have to, but hunting and trapping is all I know." Marty had felt deflated, thinking the conversation was going nowhere after all. What would you think if I told you that the days you're out hunting could earn you double the amount of money for no extra work? That had certainly gotten Ray's attention. I'd think stop messing with me, Marty, and tell me more. Ray could still remember how his heart had started to beat faster as Marty described exactly how Ray could earn more if he was willing to help Marty out. All Ray needed to do was wait for the folks in outlying ranches to be out of the homestead, working on the land, and then slip into their barns and homes and steal a few items. It sounded so simple, Ray could hardly believe it. As Marty had pointed out, Ray was already out in the hills, hunting. Folks were used to seeing him and his old horse in the district, so they wouldn't think anything of it. Whether it was a few pieces of jewelry or tools from barns, Marty confided that he had plenty of customers who were willing and able to pay good money for the stolen items. I need a man I can trust to give me a regular supply of items to sell on. Of course, you'll get a handsome cut of the money for your troubles. They had clinked glasses and agreed to give it a try, and the rest of the night had become a blur as Ray looked forward to having the sort of money that Marty seemed happy to throw around. It had been 6 months since that first meeting with Marty, and Ray had quickly adapted to his new illegal ventures. He would patiently wait outside in the woods, watching people's comings and goings on the ranches he decided to target. Folks are so stupid. They have their little routines and don't even notice me watching, he had explained gleefully to Marty one day when he was handing over his stolen goods. I can be in and out in a flash, and I bet they don't even realize anything has gone missing until weeks later. That's what I like to hear, Marty had said, slapping him on his back and buying him another drink. This could be a very profitable friendship for both of us, Ray, if you just do as I tell you and keep up the good work. But now, this wretched stranger has spoiled everything. Ray peered out of his grimy cabin window, feeling suddenly panicked that the man might have returned. He scanned the landscape and heaved a sigh of relief when he saw it was all quiet, save for John's annoying children playing in their yard next door. He poured some coffee into his battered tin mug, wishing his hands would stop trembling. Everything was going perfectly. But now it's not. He scowled at the thought that his profitable little sideline was coming to an abrupt halt. He hated walking away from easy money. He took a slug of the scalding coffee and tried to think logically about what had just happened earlier that morning. The stranger seemed to know all about him, calling him by his name as he came to a halt at the end of the drive. Ray had asked him outright who he was, and the man had introduced himself as Mr. Smith. But the smirk on his face told Ray that it was probably a made-up name. Howdy, Ray. It's come to my attention that you're stealing from the local ranches and that your friend Marty is selling the goods on. Mr. Smith's manner had been easy, as if he was used to getting his own way. His opening words weren't a question, just a statement of fact. Stealing? I don't know what you're talking about. Ray had done his best to appear nonchalant, but he'd felt at a distinct disadvantage as the man looked down at him from his sleek horse. Don't treat me like a fool, Mr. Smith had continued softly. He had the kind of voice and commanding demeanor that was hard to turn away from. I've been watching you for weeks, and I know exactly what you two are up to. The trouble is, you're disrupting my business, encroaching on something I've taken a lot of time and effort to get established. Ray hadn't been able to stop his mouth from gaping open. So you're telling me you're a thief? He had chuckled, feeling suddenly more sure of himself. What's to stop me from going to see Sheriff Jackson straight away and reporting you? He had continued, shaking his head at what a simpleton this stranger seemed to be. I doubt you'd want to attract the attention of the sheriff, Mr. Smith had replied, giving Ray a smile that verged on pity. Not with all that money you owe at the gambling tables, and the young women queuing up to tell him about how you beat them black and blue when you think you can get away with it. Ray had tried to think of a quick reply to put the man back in his place, but his mind was still sluggish from the night before, and he had just shrugged. You've got nothing on me. Otherwise, you would have already gone to see Sheriff Jackson. Mr. Smith had pulled back his jacket to reveal his pistol. The meaning was clear. For both our sakes, it's best not to involve the law. Your friend Marty is a dumb fool, getting too greedy for his own good. I insist you stop what you're doing before you ruin everything I've worked so hard to set up." "And what if I don't?" Ray had said, determined to bluff his way out of the situation. "I think you know what will happen. Good day to you, Ray. And remember, I'll be watching to make sure you do what I've asked." The stranger had tipped his hat and trotted away, whistling a cheerful tune as Ray's stomach churned with rage. The coffee started to work its magic, and Ray felt a plan starting to form in his mind. During his last hunting trip, he had stolen a few items of jewelry that he hadn't handed over to Marty yet. He figured they would be worth a pretty penny, but perhaps it was time for him to have all the spoils instead of sharing them with Marty. He would hide them in John's barn on his boundary, the one he knew his neighbor rarely used during the summer and fall months when his cattle were outside. Then, the next time he was heading to Hudsonville, he would sell them and pocket all the money himself. "It's time to cut my losses with Marty," he muttered, gulping down the last dregs of coffee and pulling on his coat. Ray strode outside and hastily saddled up his horse to head for the Black Crow Saloon, where Marty could usually be found. As his horse ambled along the dusty road, he thought back to his conversation with John a few hours earlier. His clean-living neighbor with impeccable morals irritated him, and he felt a sudden urge to find himself a beautiful wife just out of spite, to prove to folks that he wasn't the failure everyone thought he was. "I'll show them," he mumbled. He started to compose a new advertisement in his head. A successful trapper seeks a hard-working young woman to be his bride. A good-looking gentleman of private means and a spacious homestead close to town for all the amenities is looking for a kind-hearted wife to share his life with. He lifted his hat and scratched his head. Maybe he should add that he owned a generous plot of land, too. Women seemed to like that. By the time he reined his horse to a halt at the far end of town, he had cast himself as practically the most successful person in Rocky River. But with a humble attitude and willingness to provide a wonderful life for the right woman, of course, he thought with a chuckle. "Who could resist?" he said to his horse, hitching him on the side of the road. He would even say that he didn't mind if they had a child. He would soon lay down the rules to make sure the brat didn't annoy him, and an extra pair of hands about the place would be useful, he figured. Getting married would solve all his problems. He would be able to explain to Marty that he couldn't disappear off into the mountains for weeks at a time, which would mean he could stop stealing without Marty realizing the real reason why. Better still, he would have someone to wait on him, hand and foot. It was all perfect as long as she didn't stop him from going out drinking when the urge took him. The creaking sign of the Black Crow Saloon caught his attention, and he felt overcome with a powerful thirst. He would enjoy an hour at the bar, then place a new advertisement with Mrs. Devereaux, he thought to himself with a grin. Perhaps encountering the stranger wouldn't be the disaster he'd first thought it to be. Chapter 5. Boston, Massachusetts, 1879. "Hazel, Hazel, will you hurry up and bring my morning coffee through to the study?" Edward's command from the kitchen doorway was curt with irritation. "Don't just stand there, daydreaming," he added sharply. Hazel nodded automatically. Her pa was right. She had been standing at the kitchen sink, staring unseeing through the window for the last 10 minutes, she realized. She went through the motions of preparing Edward's morning coffee and added a slice of his favorite fruitcake to the tray as a form of apology. It was 3 days since the constable's visit, and the news of Zachary's death had still not sunk in properly because she had gotten so used to him being away for work. It felt like he was away traveling, not that he would never come back again. How did it happen? Why was he at that low-class saloon? The questions continued to swirl through her mind, but there was so much she didn't understand. Little by little, she was resigning herself to the fact that she would never marry again and would remain working for her father, raising the boys. What will it matter to have another baby in the house? She told herself. But Edward had barely looked at her since the news. She knew he was angry about the baby, but every time she thought about the new life deep within her body, Her hands would fold protectively across her belly. None of this was her unborn child's fault, and she would love it, regardless of what had happened. As she was carrying the tray of coffee toward Edward's study, a sharp knock at the door made Hazel jump. It was all too reminiscent of the constable's visit, and she felt her breath catching in her throat with anxiety. "I'll see who it is, Pa." Hazel hastily put the tray down just inside Edward's study and went to open the heavy front door. She was surprised to see an attractive woman standing there with a determined expression on her face. She was flanked by 2 children on one side and a thick-set man on her other side. He had the look of a prize fighter about him, with a twisted nose, and she noticed how he glanced protectively toward the woman. "Are you Hazel Anderson?" the woman asked sharply. No, I'm Hazel Walker." The woman's mouth twisted into a scornful smile. "Is that what you think?" she spat. She opened her reticule and pulled a piece of paper out, clutching it possessively to her chest. "My name is Audrey Walker, and I am Zachary's wife." She unfolded the document, waving it under Hazel's nose with an air of desperation. "If you don't believe me, this is my marriage certificate, and these are mine and Zachary's children," she added. For the second time in a week, Hazel felt the ground tilt beneath her feet and wondered if she was going to faint. She held on to the door handle, saying nothing until the moment had passed. The children looked to be about the same age as Frank and Peter, which made no sense. "What do you mean? You're Zachary's wife?" she whispered. "He told me he was a single man before we got married 6 months ago." Zachary always had a habit of changing the truth to suit what he wanted. The woman folded the piece of paper up again and put it back in her reticule before snapping it closed. "He had many dalliances during our marriage, Miss Anderson, but I am the only woman he really loved. Whatever sort of relationship you think you had with my husband, it was nothing." "That's not true. Zachary loved me. We were married by a traveling preacher, and he was going to buy a house here in Boston for us to raise a family together." "Did your family attend the wedding?" the man on the doorstep suddenly asked. "This is my sister, Audrey," he explained, "and it's up to me to look after her and the children now." Hazel fell silent as she thought back to her wedding day with Zachary. His proposal had come out of the blue after a few short weeks of him courting her. Rather than having a wedding at the church that she and her family attended, he had whisked her away in a gleaming carriage to a small country chapel just outside Boston, where they had been married that very same day. At the time, she had thought it was quite the most romantic thing to have ever happened to her. But now she had a sickening realization that perhaps the wedding had not even been conducted by a real preacher. She would never know, but from the pitying expression on Audrey's face, it seemed like Zachary had deceived her. "We live 2 days' journey away from Boston," Audrey continued. "Zachary traveled a lot with his work, and I wouldn't be surprised if he took up with you just to have somewhere nice to stay when he was working here." She glanced up at the elegant house. "He always did have aspirations of grandeur," she added with a weary sigh. "Are you talking about Papa?" one of the children asked, looking between Audrey and Hazel. "Who is this woman?" the little girl added, her eyes round with confusion. Hazel had been ready to robustly defend her position as Zachary's wife, but at the sight of the 2 young children, she couldn't help but think it would be the wrong thing to do. They didn't deserve to have the memory of their pa spoiled in such a way. "Have you spoken with the constable who found him?" Hazel asked Audrey quietly. For the first time, the woman's eyes filled with tears, and Hazel felt a wave of regret and anger for how Zachary had treated them all so thoughtlessly. "We've arranged to hold the funeral back home," Audrey's brother said firmly as she dried her tears. "It's for family only," he added. "Brent has arranged everything," Audrey said, shooting her brother a grateful look. Hazel nodded miserably. She wouldn't even get to say goodbye to the man she thought had loved her. Without thinking, her hands folded across her belly protectively. Audrey's sharp-eyed gaze followed Hazel's hands, and her mouth pinched together in a firm line. "I've spoken with our family lawyer. The children and I stand to inherit everything that belonged to Zachary, which is as it should be." Her demeanor had turned cold and businesslike again. "The thing is, Brent continued. The lawyer knows that Zachary had a wandering eye. He told us that if anyone else claimed to be his wife, Zachary's money might have to be split between everyone, and we can't allow that to happen. But none of this was my fault. I truly believed I was his wife. I am his wife, Hazel cried. She suddenly realized how little she had known about her husband. Had he been a wealthy man after all? A new thought occurred to her. If I inherit from Zachary, I can give my baby a better life, instead of just being treated as Pa's servant. She suddenly felt overcome with the need to protect her baby's future. Her unborn child deserved a good start in life too, even if Audrey didn't agree. Brent stepped closer and thrust his face into Hazel's. His eyes were dark with anger, and his hands bunched into fists by his side. The best thing you can do, Miss Anderson, is to forget that you ever knew Zachary Walker. You were never married. Despite what you believe, you were nothing to him. He peered over Hazel's shoulder, taking in the elegant furniture in the hallway behind her. You don't need Zachary's money, and you certainly don't deserve it. If you do anything to ruin Audrey's chances with this inheritance, you'll have me to answer to. Hazel stumbled backward a couple of steps, her heart hammering at the force of the brutish threat. I won't say anything, but what about my baby? I'm glad to hear it, Brent growled, cutting across her plea. It would be a shame for something bad to happen to any of you, he added with a slight smirk. That pretty younger sister of yours or your two younger brothers could get into all manner of trouble if you don't forget all about Zachary. I'm sure your pa will look after you and your illegitimate offspring. Hazel gasped at the implication of what he was saying, wondering how long they had been watching the house. I knew nothing about Zachary's business dealings, she said hastily. He just stayed here when his work brought him to Boston. He borrowed some money from my pa, but I guess we'll never get that back. Please don't do anything to harm my family. Audrey shrugged and clutched her reticule tighter. I think you understand the situation now, Miss Anderson, she said dismissively. I don't expect to ever hear from you or see you again. Come along, children, it's time for us to go home. With that, she turned on her heel, and they climbed into the waiting carriage at the end of the street, leaving Hazel open-mouthed with shock. Every part of Hazel ached with weariness by the evening. Her heart felt heavy with sadness at the way Zachary had treated her. Her legs ached with tiredness from the many hours of chores she had carried out since Audrey's visit in a hopeless quest to subdue her mind, which was filled with terrified thoughts about her future. Sit down, Hazel, and let me make dinner for tonight for you. You look exhausted. Laura bustled into the kitchen, her cheeks pink from the brisk walk back through town from the dressmaker's where she had been working for the last few months. Tears pooled in Hazel's eyes at her sister's kindness, and through gasping sobs, she told Laura about Audrey and Brent's visit that morning. Pa overheard everything, and he's furious, she finished, drying her tears on the corner of her apron. He's been in his study ever since, probably drinking and contemplating what a failure I am. Hush now, don't speak like that. I've been thinking about your situation ever since the news about Zachary's death. Laura poured a cup of tea for Hazel and then delved into her basket, pulling out a crumpled newspaper. A woman came into the shop yesterday to order 2 new dresses to travel in. She's moving out west to California in a couple of weeks as a mail-order bride to marry a hotel owner who wants a wife. What are you talking about, Laura? Hazel took a sip of tea, feeling slightly better, as her sister smoothed the creases out of the newspaper on the table. She met her new husband through this paper, the Matrimonial Times, Laura explained. As soon as I heard that, I thought of you, so I went and purchased this copy on my way home. It's full of advertisements from men out west in the frontier lands who are looking for brides to travel out and marry. I'm sure that's very interesting, but what does it have to do with me? I thought this would be a way for you to have a fresh start. You and the baby. It would be perfect, especially considering what you've just told me about Zachary's other family. Hazel shook her head, wondering whether her sister was perhaps too young after all to have understood a word she'd said. What man would want me? She asked sadly. I'm an unmarried woman, expecting the child of a man who used me for his own pleasure and deceived me. No upstanding, God-fearing gentleman would want a woman like me. especially not carrying another man's child. She blinked back her tears again at how bleak her future seemed. Laura hurried to her sister's side and knelt down next to her, giving her a beseeching look. "Don't speak about yourself in such a horrible way," she said, rubbing Hazel's hands. "You're beautiful and kind-hearted, and it's not your fault that Zachary behaved so badly. Besides, you're wrong. There are good men in these advertisements who seem perfectly happy to marry a woman who might already have children. Your situation doesn't have to spell disaster. You can still marry well, and to a man who loves you for real." Hazel picked up the newspaper and glanced at it. Her curiosity was piqued in spite of the doubts and questions that rushed into her mind. "What is that?" Edward's question came out louder than usual because of the liquor he had been drinking all afternoon. He snatched the newspaper from Hazel's hand and looked at it before glancing down at her with a look of disgust on his face. "It's nothing, Pa," Hazel said hastily. She darted Laura a warning look, not wanting her to say anything, but her sister gave their pa a bright smile, ignoring the warning. "I think this could be the answer to Hazel's problems," she said. "So she's told you then," Edward sneered. "My own daughter was foolish enough to get taken in by that rogue silver-tongued charm, and now she's left pregnant and an unmarried mother. Your sister has brought shame on this family, Laura. What will all my business acquaintances and colleagues at the bank think about it?" he demanded. He threw the paper down on the table again and raised his hand, looking as though he was about to strike Hazel. "Stop, Pa, stop!" Laura cried. She grabbed Edward's arm to stop him from going further. "Ma would never have wanted you to be so unkind." Edward's arm dropped limply by his side again, and then he groaned and rubbed his hands over his eyes. "Look what you've turned me into," he shouted at Hazel. "I can't bear to have you living here any longer. The shame of it is too great. You got fooled by a thief and a liar. How will I ever live it down?" "That's what I'm saying about this newspaper," Laura said. She quickly poured a cup of strong coffee and handed it to Edward to help him sober up. "There are all these gentlemen in the West advertising for brides. Hazel could marry a kind-hearted man and start a new life far away from anyone who might gossip about her situation." Edward blinked slowly and picked the newspaper up again. Hazel expected him to scornfully dismiss the idea immediately, but much to her surprise, he seemed interested, even going so far as to read some of the advertisements as he drank his coffee. A tentative smile lifted the corners of his mouth. "This is an excellent idea, Laura," he muttered, adjusting his glasses and nodding to himself. "I will read this newspaper from cover to cover this evening and choose the men who I consider most suitable for you, Hazel," he declared. "You will marry whoever writes back with the best offer." "But what if that's not what I want? Who will take care of Frank and little Paul if I'm living hundreds of miles away? I thought you wanted me to help raise the boys." Edward shook his head decisively. "You can't stay here in Boston, not in your condition. As soon as the baby begins to show, I will lose all credibility. Did you hear what Audrey and her brother said earlier?" he added. "It's best that you forget everything to do with Zachary. If you stay here, you would have to give the baby up to the foundling hospital. Everyone would know that you are a fallen woman." "But so would a husband out west," Hazel countered, leaping to her feet. She was determined to try and take back some control over her own future. "I can't just leave Laura and the boys behind. I would miss them terribly." "I have been planning to ask Winifred to marry me," Edward continued with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Between her and Laura, the boys will be taken care of. My mind is made up. But Pa, I've only just lost Zachary." "No, Hazel, there's no time to lose. An arranged marriage for you out west will be perfect. I will say in the advertisement that you were widowed, so nobody would ever need to know about the shameful way your baby was conceived by lies and deceit." Hazel sighed. She knew there would be no changing her father's mind, not now. "Can't I at least have some say in who I will marry?" she pleaded. "I can choose who will suit me best." "Certainly not." Edward folded the newspaper and tucked it into his pocket. "The least you have to do with it, the better. Look what a disaster you already made with Zachary. You can't be trusted with something this important," he added coldly. "I know exactly the sort of man who will suit you, and I will write the first letters. It's the best way to sort out this mess you've gotten yourself into." In the end, 4 letters was all it took, much to Hazel's surprise. Her pa had scoured the newspaper and selected 4 gentlemen in Wyoming, California, and Oregon. Writing as though he was Hazel, he took great care to explain that she had sadly been widowed and was eager to put her past behind her and have a fresh start out west. She had considerable experience running a house, cooking, and raising her younger brothers after her ma had passed away. He also explained that she was with child and that the baby would be born sometime in the spring, which was why she hoped to travel west as soon as possible. Hazel hardly knew what to think anymore. In her best moments, she imagined herself being welcomed in a distant town by a man who would come to love her and accept everything about her. But in the dead of night, when she couldn't sleep, she feared that she might end up all alone, far away, married to a man she didn't know, just like Zachary had turned out. She felt as though she could no longer trust herself to know right from wrong. As the weeks passed and no replies came back, she started to think that perhaps it might come to nothing. She figured that she could maybe just stay inside the house until after the baby was born, and hope that once her pa met his new grandchild, he would be happy for her to stay and forgive everything that had happened. Frank and Paul seemed extra clingy. It was as though they sensed they were about to lose the only person they really remembered who cared for them like a mother, which made it even harder for Hazel to think about leaving. "Dear Lord, will you please give me strength to do what is right for my family and for my unborn child?" she whispered, standing in the kitchen one day. She clasped her hands together and closed her eyes. I wish I knew the right thing to do," she murmured. She wanted a fresh start, but with the right man as her husband. But also, the pain of knowing that she would never see her family again. Laura, who was so dear to her, and the boys, who filled her heart with joy. It was almost too much to bear. She reached for the vegetables that she needed to prepare for dinner. Just at that moment, she felt a strange sensation within her belly. It reminded her of seeing a butterfly tapping its wings against the window, trying to get out. She gasped and put her hands on the slight swell of her stomach. There it was again, a light but noticeable flutter. Her eyes filled with tears. But this time it was with happiness. Her baby was moving inside her, and suddenly she felt as though a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. All her indecision melted away, and she realized what a blessing the baby was. Laura was right. A new start out west was what she needed, and she would put her trust in the Lord that she would end up with the right man, who would be a kind-hearted husband to her and a caring pa to her baby. "I will always do what's best for you," she whispered, stroking her apron, which lay over the soft curve of her belly. She remembered what it had felt like to hold little Paul in her arms after he had been born, and how much joy it had given her, even though it had been filled with sadness because of losing her dear ma as well. Suddenly, her happiness was tinged with fear. What if I lose the baby? What if I die, bringing the baby into the world as Ma did? As her emotions swung between fear and hope, she turned to her faith again. "Lord, please help me meet the right man who will be happy to take care of my unborn child and me. And please, in your mercy, give this baby all the love and happiness it deserves through your bountiful goodness. Amen." Just as Hazel was picking up the first potato to peel, Laura's exuberant shout echoed down the hallway. "You've got a reply. Look, Hazel, it's a letter all the way from Wyoming." Chapter 6. Rocky River, Wyoming. Hazel sat up straighter in the back of the stagecoach as it approached Rocky River, eager to see her new surroundings. The journey had been long and tiring. For the first couple of days on the railroad, all she could think about was her tearful farewell with Laura and the boys. Even her pa had cleared his throat, fighting back his emotion at the realization that he would probably never see his daughter again. "Promise you'll write to us," Frank had said, maintaining a stoic expression. Paul had thrown himself against Hazel's legs, gripping onto them like a limpet to a rock, and then sobbed as Laura gently peeled him off. "Of course I will. I'll send you presents for Christmas, and perhaps one day you can come to visit." Paul had cheered up at the thought of presents, and Winifred took the boys to look at their books in Edward's study so they wouldn't get overly distressed. "If Pa starts asking you to do too much, perhaps you and the boys could join me one day?" Hazel had whispered to Laura on the doorstep before the Brougham arrived to take her to the railroad station. "He said he'll hire a maid instead. In fact, I think it was Miss Neal's idea. She said it would be good for me to continue working at the dressmaker's shop. I can't believe it's time to leave, and I'll be married in a few short weeks. Perhaps there might be other suitable gentlemen out west for you when you're older." Laura had brightened at Hazel's suggestion. "I've decided that Winifred won't make such a bad stepmother, but if things work out well for you, I might very well come to join you in Wyoming. I'm sure Pa would be happy for me to be married off to a wealthy landowner like you one day," she chuckled. Hazel had pored over the letters from her husband-to-be for the next few days on the railroad. There was only a handful, and they didn't reveal a great deal about the man she was about to meet. But her Pa hadn't considered this to be a problem. Every fiber of Edward's being wanted Hazel and her ever-expanding waistline out of sight. The quicker she left Boston, the better, as far as he was concerned. The gentleman Hazel corresponded with described himself as a businessman with land at the edge of a thriving frontier town called Rocky River. He had a comfortable log cabin and a handful of animals, with a captivating view of the mountains. It sounded idyllic. What had made Edward most delighted was the fact that the gentleman hadn't seemed the slightest bit bothered about Hazel expecting a baby. It seemed as though Hazel's prayers had been heard, and she understood that once her homesickness passed, she had a fresh start ahead of her with a chance to make something better of herself. The one thing troubling her was that her Pa had insisted she must maintain the charade of being a widow. "You thought the marriage to that scoundrel was genuine, so it's not really a lie," he had said firmly. "Just keep it up until you're properly wed, and then if you need to tell your new husband about this disastrous episode, it's on your head. I suggest you keep it secret forever." Hazel felt a pang of guilt every time she thought back to her Pa's words. His conscience might not be troubled, but Hazel had learned the hard way that honesty mattered, and telling a lie in the Lord's eyes didn't sit well with her. "Are you looking forward to your new life?" the old lady who was in the stagecoach with Hazel asked curiously. She had only joined the journey at Hudsonville and seemed pleasant enough, but Hazel was feeling too nervous to make much conversation. "I think I am," she said hesitantly. "It's so very different from what I'm used to back in Boston, but I like the idea of living in a frontier town." The other ladies on the train heading west told me that it's a good place to raise a family, and folks are friendly. The old woman patted her on her knee and gave her a warm smile. "We are, my dear. I've lived here for coming up to 10 years with my husband. I met him through an advertisement," she added with a twinkle in her eye. "I'm sure you'll settle in just fine with your new husband." Hazel hadn't told the woman that she was coming out west to get married, but she must have made the assumption based on how many mail-order brides came to these parts. And of all ages, too, she thought with surprise, judging by what the woman had just told her. A moment later, the stagecoach came to a stop on the main street of Rocky River. The driver clambered down from his seat up front and opened the door. "I expect you'll be glad to have a good night's rest, ma'am," he said courteously as he helped Hazel down. "My wife and I have 4 children, and I doubt she would have enjoyed making this journey when she was in the family way. Make sure your new husband takes good care of you," he added with a grin. The old woman bustled away, arm in arm with a gray-haired gentleman who had been waiting for her. Hazel looked up and down the street. Her future husband had described himself as tall and dark-haired, with blue eyes and tanned from being outside. Although he hadn't said so directly, she sensed that he was good-looking. The only trouble is, there's nobody matching that description anywhere in sight. Hazel pushed down the sense of panic that was starting to bubble up in her chest. "It's not unusual for a gentleman to show up late," the stagecoach driver said when he saw her worried expression. "Oh, it's fine." She opened her fan and fluttered it in front of her face, feeling her cheeks turning pink as a couple of passers-by turned to stare. This is my regular time arriving, but I expect he's just gotten held up somewhere. Folks don't like to rush, and things aren't so regimented out west compared to what you're used to in Boston," he added, as if this explained everything. Hazel tried not to let her disappointment show on her face. If people were more relaxed about timekeeping in Rocky River, she would just have to get used to it. There was nothing to worry about. She felt the baby kick under her dress and absent-mindedly rubbed her hand over her small bump, wondering if she could risk going into a tea room for a glass of water. She didn't want him to arrive and think she hadn't turned up. "There's a very respectable boarding house if you head up the road," the driver said, jerking his head in the direction they had just come from. "You might have seen it, the Rosebush Inn. A lot of mail-order brides stay there for a couple of nights when they arrive. Why don't you go and have a cup of tea and a rest there for a little while?" A wave of tiredness suddenly swept over Hazel, and the thought of sitting quietly in a guest house sounded almost irresistible. "Don't worry, ma'am. I'm not leaving for a little while, so when your gentleman arrives, I'll just send him up there to fetch you. I would offer to carry your bag and take you there myself, but I don't like to leave the stagecoach unattended. We do occasionally get thieves and outlaws in Rocky River, and I can't afford for anyone to steal my horses or damage the coach." Hazel nodded with relief. It only looked like a 10-minute walk to the boarding house, and it would give her a chance to wash her face and brush her hair before meeting her future husband. She picked up her carpet bag and hurried away, enjoying being able to stretch her legs after sitting for so long. As Hazel rounded the corner and spotted the boarding house the stagecoach driver had recommended, her spirits lifted. There was a well-tended garden full of roses out front, which gave the Rosebush Inn its name, and it looked respectable enough for a single lady to be there, much to her relief. A maid was pegging washing out behind the building, and the sheets rippled in the warm breeze. And she heard the sound of laughter drifting toward her from two women sitting on the veranda. It was certainly giving her a good first impression of the town she would be calling home. "I'm finished for the day, Eli." A deep voice caught her attention, and she noticed a man hastily packing tools into the back of a small wagon. It looked like the inn was being extended to accommodate more guests. Against the sun, the man's silhouette was tall and broad-shouldered. He suddenly caught sight of her and stopped what he was doing, striding toward her purposefully. He lifted his hat, and as he got closer, she could see that his wavy hair was dark, and his eyes were the color of blue cornflower. Hazel's heart skipped a beat as she smiled up at him, noticing the warmth in his expression. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to rush you at your work. The stagecoach driver explained that you might have gotten delayed." She extended her arm to shake hands with him. "It's wonderful to meet you. I'm Hazel Anderson. I have so enjoyed reading your letters, and it's lovely to finally meet you face to face." The man politely shook hands with her, but then took a couple of steps back, looking puzzled, which was not the welcome she had expected. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I think you must be mistaken. I'm John Fisher. I'm not meeting anyone. I'm building some new rooms for Eli and Suzanne, and I saw you struggling with your luggage and thought you might need a hand. Are you staying at the Rosebush Inn for a while?" Hazel felt the blood rush to her cheeks in embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Fisher. My fiancé described himself as tall, with dark hair and blue eyes, and tanned from being outside." This time, her glance up at him was shy. "You matched the description, and I made a silly assumption that you must be him." Mr. Fisher chuckled with amusement, but in a way that implied the joke was on him, not to make Hazel feel bad. "It's not your fault at all, Miss Anderson. It's an easy mistake to make when you're arriving in Rocky River and meeting someone for the first time. I admire the courage of mail-order brides like you. I'm not sure I would be able to head to a strange town to start a new life." Hazel felt her embarrassment recede. It was kind of him to try and put her at ease. "Do you mind me asking who you're here to meet? I know most folks in town, and I might be able to go let him know you've arrived." "Oh, I don't want to trouble you, Mr. Fisher. My fiancé is a gentleman called Mr. Manning. I expect he's busy and forgot the time. He has a lot of business interests, and so many people in town need his time." "Hold up a minute. Did you say Mr. Manning?" Mr. Ray Manning? Is that who you've come to meet, to marry? Hazel noticed Mr. Fisher's eyes widen, and he coughed to cover his surprise. Yes, that's the gentleman I've been corresponding with. Is there a problem? Hazel looked down the street again, wondering when he would arrive. No, I just didn't realize he was taking a bride. I mean, he told me he placed an advertisement a few months ago, but that was all. I should explain. Ray is my neighbor. That's lovely. We'll be able to invite you and your family to dinner, Hazel said. She flushed again, hoping she didn't sound desperate. She had been worried about whether she would make new friends in Rocky River, and the thought of having kind-hearted neighbors nearby was a relief. Mr. Manning was very modest in his letters, but reading between the lines, I could tell that he's a busy man, what with his charitable good works in the community and a ranch to run, as well as his other business interests. Charitable good works, huh? Mr. Fisher scratched his head, and his expression was hard to read. How about I introduce you to Suzanne and Eli, the owners of the Rosebush? You could probably use a cup of tea while you wait for Mr. Manning to arrive. That's very kind, but I don't want to hold you up. It looks like you were packing up for the day. It's no problem. The children aren't expecting me home just yet. Mr. Fisher picked up her heavy bag and ushered her up the path, but before they reached the front door, a rickety wagon pulled up behind them in a cloud of dust. Are you Hazel? The voice was loud, and Hazel spun around, her heart beating faster again. I got held up in town on business. A man shambled toward her with a sheepish grin. His dark hair hung in greasy tendrils on his collar, and his jacket was stained with something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. He spat on his hand and wiped it on his trousers before grasping hers and shaking it enthusiastically. Ray Manning, pleased to make your acquaintance. Mr. Manning? Hazel wondered if there had been some sort of mistake as she took in his scruffy appearance and the skinny horse with sores on its legs harnessed to the wagon, which looked like it was about to fall apart. I had to meet a fellow about something, but I'm here now. Hop up and we'll get along to see Pastor Franklin. You'll be a married woman before sundown. He grinned and gave her a wink, letting his gaze linger on her shapely figure. Have you been at the saloon? Mr. Fisher asked bluntly. His blue eyes had darkened, and Hazel wondered why he looked angry. It's where I do business occasionally, John. What's it to you? Hazel could smell the stale liquor on his breath and was filled with a sudden sense of foreboding that she had made a terrible decision. Well, maybe you'll want to have a cup of coffee and a wash before you get wed, Mr. Fisher said gruffly. He gave Hazel a brief nod and put his hat back on. If you ever need me, I live just... Thank you, John. You'd best get back to those children of yours before they cause havoc running wild in the front paddock, Ray said, grabbing Hazel's arm and pulling her toward his wagon. Thank you for your help, Mr. Fisher, Hazel said hastily to his retreating back. That man is an annoying busybody, Ray declared, shaking his head. He can't even keep his own family under control, so he has no right sticking his nose into my business. Is it far to go to see the pastor? Hazel asked as he shoved her up into the seat, throwing her bag carelessly into the back of the wagon. No, he's at the far end of town. Ray picked up the reins and slapped them on the horse's back. I didn't book an appointment to get wed, but I'm sure it will be fine. Pastor Franklin will fit us in if he knows what's good for him. Hazel glanced surreptitiously back toward the Rosebush Inn, where Mr. Fisher was watching them with a troubled look on his face. I wish I was going to his ranch instead of Mr. Manning's. The thought came out of nowhere and caught Hazel off guard. She instantly felt guilty and remembered that Ray had a lot to commend him, not least that he didn't mind that she was expecting another man's child. Give him a chance. He's probably been too busy with work to have time to get spruced up for meeting me. Do not judge according to appearance. She remembered the words from church and turned to Ray with a smile. Tell me more about Rocky River, Mr. Manning. It sure looks like a charming town, and everyone seems very friendly. I can't wait to see where you live. Chapter 7. Well, charming is one word for it, Ray replied. I suppose I don't have much to judge it against, as I've never lived anywhere fancy like Boston. And as for folks being friendly, There are plenty of people who like to meddle in my business here, so it's best not to tell them too much. Hazel nodded, privately wondering why a man who claimed to be such an important part of Rocky River seemed to be warning her against chatting with people. I think the town looks nicer than Boston. I was surrounded by buildings where I used to live, but the scenery here is so inspiring. She gave Ray a hesitant smile, hoping that he wouldn't be too difficult to warm to, but he just grunted and shrugged. "What business are you in?" she asked, thinking he would prefer to talk about that. "It sounds from your letters like you work hard, but I wasn't exactly sure what you do, and I'd love to know more. My pa works at the bank." She decided not to mention anything about Zachary's job, if indeed he had even been telling the truth about it. "Oh, a bit of this and a bit of that. I used to be a trapper, but lately I've gotten into a few other things as well, which are more lucrative," Ray said vaguely. "There's the church up ahead," he said, pointing at a modest wooden building with a cross on top of the roof. Hazel looked toward the church, half hoping that the pastor would not be there. She felt as though everything was happening too quickly, slipping out of her control. Now that she was here, the thought of being wed within hours felt like a mistake. She would have liked to have a few days, or even a few weeks, to get to know Ray Manning a bit better before marrying him. Time is of the essence. It's better if you get married while the baby is barely showing. Her pa's words came back to her, and she shivered slightly in spite of the warmth of the sun. "There's nobody at home except me," Ray said, as if reading her mind. That meant there was no chaperone, which would explain why he was in such a hurry to get married. Although, to look at it more generously, he was trying to do the gentlemanly thing. "Good afternoon, Ray," Pastor Franklin said as he came out of the church. He turned to lock the door behind him. "I haven't seen you in the congregation for at least a year. What brings you here today?" Hazel noticed Ray's mouth pinch with irritation. She was sure he had told her in his letters that he went to church every week and wondered whether there was a different one closer to where he lived. "I'm here to get married," Ray said brusquely. "To this woman, here," he added, jerking his head in Hazel's direction. He jumped down from his wagon and glared at the pastor. "We'll only need 5 minutes of your time, so you'd better unlock the door and get on with it." Pastor Franklin shook his head apologetically before glancing curiously up at Hazel. "Sorry, Ray. I'm already running late. I have a 5-hour ride ahead of me to go and bury Old Man Williams at his ranch. The family is expecting me. I'm afraid your wedding will have to wait a few days." Ray scowled. "If he's already dead, what does it matter if you're a few minutes late? I think it's mighty rude of you to turn me away like this. As far as I recall, you didn't book a wedding. Most folks know to make an appointment." The pastor's rebuke was mild, but he made no move to unlock the door again. "I'm sure Pastor Franklin isn't saying this to be deliberately awkward," Hazel said hastily. "Perhaps I could stay a few nights at the Rosebush Inn until it's more convenient." She hoped her sense of relief wasn't too obvious, but the slight twitch of the pastor's eyebrows made her wonder whether he realized. "I didn't have you down as the marrying kind, Ray," the pastor remarked as he turned the door handle to make doubly sure it was locked. "Aren't you going to introduce me properly to your wife-to-be?" "Hazel Anderson," she said quickly. "I've taken my pa's name again since being widowed," she explained to Ray. Even though she had told her pa she would refer to herself as Mrs. Walker, she couldn't bring herself to do it. "Hazel, that's her name, and whether you think I'm the marrying kind or not is none of your business." Ray sighed at the inconvenience of having to come back another day. "I'm not made of money to pay for her to stay at the boarding house." A sly expression came over his face. "I suppose, seeing as she's already in the family way by another man, I could just take her out to my house anyway." His words hung in the air like a challenge, making Hazel blush at the way he had drawn attention to her condition so blatantly. "I don't think the Lord would approve of that," Pastor Franklin said firmly. "Can't you take a joke?" The pastor ignored Ray's lewd snigger and gave Hazel a kind smile. "If you explain to Eli and Suzanne that I wasn't able to conduct your marriage, I'm sure they will give you a favorable rate to stay there until I return." "Thank you. The stagecoach driver said it's a respectable place to stay." Hazel felt a wash of shame at how Ray didn't seem to care much about her feelings. Perhaps I don't deserve it, she thought to herself. As Pa said, I'm a fallen woman. I hope Mr. Manning will take care of you until I'm back, he added. The way the pastor was defending her honor was almost enough to make Hazel cry, and she blinked her tears back, not wanting to look weak. Pa gave me a little bit of extra money for travel expenses, she said to her fiancé. It will give me a chance to get to know the town a little bit better, so I'll know where to come for supplies, given that you're such a busy man, Ray. I guess, Ray harumphed, agreeing grudgingly with her. Friday afternoon, it is then? He scrambled back up into the wagon. Don't let me down again, he added, glaring at the pastor. I want Miss Anderson living at my house, taking care of me, not swanning around Rocky River like a lady of leisure. As the wagon rumbled away from the church, Hazel tried again not to take Ray's brisk way of speaking to heart. He had never claimed to be good with words, even mentioning in his letters that he liked to be direct. They just needed more time to get to know each other, she reminded herself. This was probably as strange for him as it was for her. It's a few hours until nightfall. You may as well come and see my place. Maybe you could even rustle up some dinner, and then I'll take you back to the Rosebush for the night. He whistled tunelessly under his breath, turning toward the outskirts of town without waiting for her to agree, but at least he seemed happier, which was something. Home. Sweet home, Ray said not too long after they had left the church. Hazel shaded her eyes with her hand and sat up straighter on the wagon, glad that the journey was almost over. The seat was hard and uncomfortable, making the baby kick more in protest, but at least she would be able to stretch her legs and hopefully have the long-awaited cup of tea she had been looking forward to since arriving in Rocky River. She looked ahead and saw a well-constructed log cabin with a veranda that wrapped all the way around the front and sides. Smoke was drifting from the chimney, making her think of cozy winter nights by the fire. She could see 2 rocking chairs next to a table on the veranda, positioned so they could look over the garden, which was a little overgrown but had a delightful array of flowers still in bloom. Off to one side of the cabin, she spotted a neat vegetable patch, and there was a washing line stretched between 2 trees with shirts pegged to it. Chickens scratched near a coop at the end of the garden, and she could hear a cockerel crowing. Clearly, she had gotten Ray wrong. He might have been dressed in scruffy clothes now, but he didn't mind doing his own laundry. She was quickly seeing him in a whole different light. There were 2 sturdy barns and a corral, as well as some smaller outbuildings, and behind the cabin she could see a small herd of cattle contentedly grazing and drinking at a water trough. The place looked idyllic, and Hazel couldn't stop herself from smiling delightedly as she turned to Ray with a look of astonishment. I never imagined it would be this beautiful, she exclaimed. Your letters didn't do it justice. Not at all. What a wonderful place to live. And just look at those views. I think it's the most beautiful place I've ever seen. Ray grinned and followed her gaze toward the mountains. I guess when you put it like that, it's not a bad place to live. I know those mountains like the back of my hand, he added. It's where I used to do most of my trapping and hunting. I'm surprised you would want to leave home when you have such a charming log cabin. I would want to spend every moment there. She suddenly felt overcome with emotion. I'm so grateful you're offering me a home here, Ray. Truly, I am. He shrugged. I suppose it suits us both. I won't ask too many questions about your past if you don't pry into my affairs. I don't go out trapping as much these days, not when there are easier ways to make money, he added cryptically. Hazel was already picturing the inside of the log cabin in her mind. She imagined a rustic living room, which, perhaps, needed a woman's touch to make it more homely. She would buy some fabric to sew patchwork quilts and hang drapes at the windows to make the rooms cozier if necessary. And then there would be the nursery to get ready for the baby. It felt like she would finally get to become the mistress of her own house instead of pandering to her pa's needs. And her mind buzzed with ideas of how she would add little touches to make Ray glad he was married. The wagon bumped over a stone, jolting her out of her musings. Did we miss the turning? she asked as they continued straight past an entrance that led off the road. Ray shot her a surprised look and then let out a snort of laughter. "Did you think that place was mine?" he asked, cocking his head toward the ranch. "Isn't it?" "No, Miss Anderson. That belongs to my neighbor." He chuckled again, shaking his head as though her suggestion was ridiculous. Hazel looked further down the road. She could see another ranch homestead in the distance, with a bigger log cabin and barns, but it was much further out of town than he had implied. All that lay between the two ranches was rolling paddocks. Her eye suddenly caught a glimpse of something else, a beaten-up shack that looked as though it was missing half its roof and was surrounded by overgrown brambles and rotten fences. 2 cows were picking at the meager tufts of dead grass in a dusty paddock, their bones jutting through their skin. They looked half-starved. She assumed the shack must be something to do with the ranch they had just passed. It wasn't a home, surely? Her heart sank as Ray pulled on the reins and the wagon bounced onto a rutted track which led directly to the shack. "What do you think of the place?" Ray asked, gesturing at it. Purslem. He sounded proud and also slightly defensive. At first, Hazel thought he was joking. "Does the track lead somewhere else?" she asked hesitantly. She saw his eyes narrow with annoyance. "When I said home sweet home, this is what I meant," he snapped. Hazel stifled a gasp as she realized this practically derelict hut was her new home. I see," she stuttered. She couldn't stop herself from looking longingly toward the pleasant homestead next door, which they had just passed. "It's not as grand as that," he said sourly, following her gaze. "But I'm sure if you put your back into it, my cabin will meet your lofty expectations soon enough." His words felt like a slap in the face, and she closed her eyes momentarily, wishing she were still at home with her family in Boston. "A woman in your condition can't be too choosy. Surely you can see that?" This time, there was an edge of scorn in Ray's words, purposely designed to put her back in her place. Before Hazel could think of a suitable reply, a scrawny dog slunk down the veranda steps to greet them. It licked its lips nervously, showing the whites of its eyes as it crawled on its belly toward Ray, who had stopped the wagon and jumped down. "See, the dog likes it well enough, so I don't want to hear any complaints." Ray chuckled at his idea of a joke. "I'm not complaining, Mr. Manning. It's just not quite what you described in your letters," Hazel shot back, coming to her senses. "I tried to get Mrs. Bell to come and tidy up before you arrived, but the stupid woman claimed she was too busy. You'll just have to take it as you find it. Make yourself at home. I'm going out back to check on a few things. You'll find food in the cupboards to make me something to eat while I'm gone." With that, Ray threw the reins over a hitching post and stomped away, leaving Hazel alone with the shocking realization that once again she had been deceived by a man who had claimed to have her best interests at heart. Chapter 8. A cool wind blew across the land, rustling the leaves on the trees. The weather had turned overnight, and it wouldn't be long before the lower slopes of the mountains would be glowing with fall colors, or the first snowfall of winter would blanket the ground. John turned up his collar and reached for another nail, hammering it into the fence post, before standing back to assess his work. The fence on the boundary between his land and Ray's was now secure again. Strictly speaking, it should have been Ray's responsibility, but John knew that his neighbor would never get around to mending the fence where it had broken in the last storm, let alone make a good job of it. The last thing he wanted was for some of his best cattle to escape onto Ray's scrubby plot of land. It was littered with weeds and rusty old tools, and he didn't want to risk any of his animals picking up some sort of nasty disease from a cut. He tidied away his tools and carried them into the barn. It would soon be time for lunch, and he was looking forward to spending some time with Emily and Reuben after working so many long days at the Rosebush Inn lately. Just as he got to the barn, he noticed Miss Anderson coming out of Ray's shack. She had a length of rope coiled in her hands, and he paused to watch her, curious to know what she would do with it. She walked toward the boundary fence where 2 aspen trees grew and started to tie the rope around one of them. John didn't want to seem as though he was spying on her, but the temptation to watch her for a little longer was overwhelming. It was only 2 days since he had seen her outside the Rosebush Inn at Rocky River, but he had been thinking about her ever since. There was something about her oval face, framed by hair the color of honey, and her gentle demeanor that he couldn't get out of his mind. He had never met a woman less suited to be married to Ray Manning, he thought to himself, for the 100th time. How his uncouth, lazy neighbor had managed to tempt her out west was a mystery. Probably by lying about his situation. "Hey, boy," he murmured to Clyde, who was calmly munching hay in his stall. Everything he had seen Hazel doing over the last couple of days at Ray's shack only convinced him even more that she was far too good for him. The first day, he had noticed her stroking Ray's dog, Bruno, and slipping him some food while Ray wasn't looking. The poor creature had been pathetically grateful and now followed Hazel everywhere like her shadow, wagging his tail every time she looked in his direction. John knew it was probably the first time the dog had ever been shown any affection. Then yesterday, while John had been working behind his barn turning wood to make new chairs for Suzanne and Eli's dining room, he had seen Hazel creep toward the boundary fence. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, then reached through the fence to pick a basket of fresh grass from his land. As soon as the basket was full, she hurried back to the 2 cows and scattered the grass on the ground in an attempt to give them the food they so desperately needed. "She's a kind-hearted woman, isn't she, Clyde? And no doubt Ray will break her spirit soon enough, just like he has with his poor animals." He forked some more hay into the feeding rack, and the horse's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice. "It's not right. I wish there was something I could do to help her," he added under his breath. The worst thing was seeing her cry. Ray had fetched Hazel from Rocky River that morning and left her getting on with trying to clean up his mess while he got stuck into a bottle of whiskey. He had soon been snoring on his hammock under the tree, and that was when John had seen Hazel crying silently on the rickety veranda. Ray's dog was resting his head on her lap, looking up at her mournfully, and it had taken all John's strength not to vault over the fence and run to her side. But he knew it wasn't his place to interfere in someone else's marriage, as much as he wanted to make sure she was all right. Also, there was the fact that Ray Manning mixed with some dubious characters, and he didn't want to antagonize the man or cause any trouble that might put Emily and Reuben in danger. John came back out of the barn, planning to head back to his log cabin to have lunch. Mrs. Bell had a strict rule that she didn't like anyone to be late to the table, and he did his best to try and keep on her good side. But just as he was turning to leave, he was alarmed to see that Hazel had her hands on her knees. She was doubled over, as though she couldn't catch her breath. He hurried over to the boundary fence. "Are you okay, Mrs. Manning?" he called. "I'm no doctor, but perhaps you should be taking it easier?" Hazel straightened up and gave him a flustered smile. "Mr. Fisher, I hadn't realized it was you who lives right next door to Ray. I mean, I saw you around, but didn't know if you were just here working." She rubbed her belly in a gesture that reminded John of when Zoe had been expecting their children. He was surprised to find that the memory brought him happiness instead of pain for the first time since her death. "Do you need to sit down?" John was pleased to see some color returning to Hazel's cheeks. In fact, he was finding it hard to look away. Her blue eyes were mesmerizing, and he stuck his hands in his pockets, suddenly realizing he was staring. "I'm used to hard work, but I guess perhaps I have been overdoing it slightly to keep Ray happy. I was trying to string up a washing line between these 2 trees and felt dizzy. It will pass in a moment." John bit back a sigh of irritation as he glanced toward Ray, who was still snoring loudly in his hammock. Not only was he lazy, but he was inconsiderate too. He should have realized how exhausted Hazel would be after the journey, but instead he was making her work from dawn until dusk. "How about I do it for you?" He climbed over the fence without waiting for her reply and quickly lashed the rope between the 2 trees, tugging it tight. "I dread to think how much laundry there is to do," he said lightly. "I don't recall ever seeing Ray hanging any washing out on the bushes to dry." Hazel shrugged, looking momentarily embarrassed. "I'm doing my best to make the shack a bit more cozy, but I don't think Ray has had time to do much with the place until now." John admired her fortitude. It would have been easy for her to complain about her uncouth husband, but clearly she didn't like to talk badly of others. He knew he should get back to the house for lunch, but now that they were chatting, he didn't want to leave. "Look, if you ever need a hand with anything, I'm always happy to help." John paused for a moment, hoping he didn't sound too forward. "I'm often around when Ray is out. It might be better to do it then, if you think he would rather not know." Hazel shot him a look of understanding. "I'm sure I'll be fine," she said shyly. "It's nice to know that you and your wife live next door. I've seen your children out playing. I enjoy hearing their laughter," she added. John saw a shadow of sorrow cross her face. "Emily and Reuben are going through a difficult phase at the moment," he explained. "My wife, Zoe, died, giving birth to Reuben 4 years ago. Mrs. Bell does her best as my housekeeper, but I must admit I find it hard to guide them in the same way as their ma would have done." John was surprised at his confession. Usually, he liked to keep matters like that private, but Hazel's kind eyes made her easy to talk to. "I'm sorry to hear that," Hazel said softly. "My ma died, giving birth to my youngest brother Paul 5 years ago. I know how hard it can be for children of that age to lose their ma." She sighed, looking sad again. "I miss my 2 brothers and my sister Laura more than I thought I would. I've looked after them since ma died, until Pa encouraged me to move out here. That's why hearing your children laugh gives me so much pleasure." "Is Ray treating you all right as his wife?" John asked hesitantly. It suddenly felt it was important to let Hazel know that she wasn't all alone, so far from her family. "It's just that he has a reputation for being a little rough, and if things ever get difficult, our door is always open. You only have to come over and find me or Mrs. Bell," he continued in a rush. He was relieved to see that she didn't look offended by his offer. She picked a wet shirt out of the laundry basket and shook the creases out before pegging it on the new washing line between them. "Actually, I'm not his wife yet," Hazel said. Her cheeks turned pink. "Pastor Franklin had to go out of town to conduct a funeral, so we're getting married tomorrow instead. That's why I've been staying at the Rosebush at night, although Ray was keen for me to make a start on keeping house for him during the day." John couldn't help but notice how Hazel grimaced slightly as she glanced toward Ray. His arm hung limply over the side of the hammock, and the empty whiskey bottle was on the ground underneath him. Flies buzzed over him, landing on his unshaven cheek, where drool was running from his open mouth. Before John could digest this information, the sound of Emily's voice interrupted them. "Pa, Mrs. Bell says it's time for lunch." Emily and Reuben tumbled down the veranda steps, racing each other to reach him first, and they came running toward him. As soon as they caught sight of Hazel, Emily grabbed Reuben's hand, and her eyes widened with surprise as they skidded to a stop. "Do we have a new neighbor, Pa?" she whispered. "I've never seen Mr. Manning have a lady so pretty visit before." John struggled not to smile at her innocent comment and saw that Hazel's eyes were twinkling with amusement as well. "Emily, Reuben, this is our new neighbor." He stopped, not sure what to call her, seeing as she wasn't yet married to Ray. Hazel stepped in to save him. "It's very nice to meet you both," she said. "I'm Hazel. I've seen you playing outside and helping your pa with his chores. I expect you're a great help to him." Emily's smile was radiant as she looked up at Hazel, slightly awestruck. "Mrs. Bell always tells us off for going outside to help Pa, but we like it better than anything, don't we, Reuben?" She nudged her brother. "Uh-huh, we sure do," Reuben agreed, nodding seriously. "When I grow up, I'm going to be a carpenter, just like Pa." "I've seen your pa's handiwork at the Rosebush Inn," Hazel said. She bent down slightly and smiled at Reuben. "He's a very skillful carpenter, and I'm sure he would love to have you working with him in the future." She stood up again and looked toward the log cabin, which John had built with his own bare hands when he had first arrived in Wyoming. "Your homestead is lovely, too," she added. "Perhaps it might inspire Ray to make a few alterations to the shack one day. Is anyone going to eat the lunch I've spent the last 2 hours cooking?" Mrs. Bell's question, which rang out from the veranda, left no doubt in anybody's mind that she was irritated. "Those children have been running rings around me all morning, Mr. Fisher, and I'm not sure if I can take much more." Emily and Reuben exchanged a guilty glance. I promise we weren't behaving badly, Pa. It's just such a lovely day, and we tried to finish our chores quickly, but Mrs. Bell doesn't like us playing outside. I only asked her 3 times if I could come out to the barn to help you, Pa, Reuben added. His bottom lip trembled as though he was about to start crying. Do you know what, children? If your Pa and Mrs. Bell agree, I would love it if you could show me around your garden in a few days. It will give me some ideas on how to make a garden of my own. I bet you can teach me a lot. John felt a rush of gratitude for Hazel as Reuben's face broke into a wide smile, and Emily nodded happily. She clearly had a way with children, from looking after her young brothers. I'm sure Mrs. Bell wouldn't mind that at all, he said quickly. As long as you're sure? Definitely, Hazel said quickly. Nothing would give me more pleasure. I'd better get back to work now. She looked guiltily over toward Ray again and quickly pegged out the remaining shirts. John noticed that Ray was stirring in his hammock. He hoped the man wouldn't be in a foul temper from his hangover. But he was at least glad that Hazel had gotten to know him and Emily and Reuben a little better. Well, good day to you, Hazel, John said, tipping his hat. And remember, we're only next door if you ever need us. As the children scampered ahead of him back to the house, he heard Mrs. Bell grumbling again about how much hard work they were being. His heart sank at the thought of trying to find another housekeeper. She had already told him that morning that her arthritis was always worse in the winter, and he wondered whether it was a hint that she was planning on quitting the job. The sun was low in the sky when John went out later that evening to shut the chickens away. He walked around the nearest paddock of his homestead, checking the cattle and thinking about the future. Mrs. Bell had been in a bad temper all afternoon, but he knew it wasn't really her fault. The joints of her hands were already red and swollen from the change in the weather, and he had suggested that she should go home early. What should I do, Lord? I want to do right by the children, but I'm not sure of the right path to give them the upbringing they deserve, he murmured. He leaned on the top rail of the fence, and his thoughts turned again toward Ray and Hazel. After getting no replies to his advertisement for a mail-order bride, John had all but given up on the thought of finding a wife for himself. But meeting Hazel had ignited a spark of hope in him again. He glanced toward Ray's shack, where a candle was flickering in the window. It almost made the place look homey, and he knew it could only be Hazel's doing. I'm lonely. If I knew I could get a wife just like her, I'd happily place another advertisement. The thought took him by surprise. He wondered whether it was really true or whether it was Hazel herself who he was falling for. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the sound of a horse loping along the road. He turned to watch, wondering who it might be, and was surprised to see the rider turn off the road onto the driveway. It was rare for Ray to get visitors, but the man was headed straight toward Ray's shack, and it looked like he was in a mighty hurry. Come outside and face me like a man instead of hiding inside like a coward, the visitor hollered. Don't make me have to come inside and drag you out, Ray. You owe me an explanation. John hurried toward the boundary, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. He didn't care about Ray's well-being, but Hazel was still there, and he feared for her safety. The shack door flew open, juddering against one of the chairs on the veranda. What do you want, Marty? Ray snarled. John held his breath. He knew Marty Hawkins, and he was a nasty piece of work. He wished he had insisted that Hazel should come to his house earlier, but now it was too late. You've been stealing things and keeping the money for yourself, haven't you? Marty yelled. He jumped down off his horse and strode toward the shack. Did you think I would let you double-cross me and do nothing about it? Quit your whining, Ray said with a shrug. John could tell that he was still drunk, which was why he wasn't taking Marty seriously. It was just a few trinkets, barely worth the effort of taking them, now that I think about it. We had an agreement, Ray. The air crackled with tension between the two men. When I met you in the Black Crow Saloon that night, you were nothing but a lazy trapper, barely making enough to get by. I cut you in on my little scheme because I trusted you. But not anymore. I don't know what you're saying. I promised the items were barely worth a couple of dollars. It's not worth falling out over. This time, Ray's voice was wheedling. "How did you find out about it, anyway?" he demanded. "I keep my ear to the ground, and there were rumors. You were seen selling silver items in Hudsonville, and I'll bet my last dollar that they were worth a lot more than you're telling me." A movement in the shack doorway suddenly caught John's eye. It was Hazel, and he almost shouted out to tell her to go back inside. "Is there a problem, Ray?" she asked softly. "Good evening, sir," she added, looking at Marty. "I'm sure your differences can be settled amicably, can't they? Shall I make a cup of coffee so you can both sit down and chat?" Marty looked up at Hazel, and his mouth gaped open in astonishment. "Not only have you double-crossed me, Ray, but you've grabbed yourself a pretty young wife as well, have you? I suppose that's why you think you can cut me out of our deal, to spend the money you owe me on her instead," he spat. Ray's snigger of laughter sounded jarring in the soft evening air. "Her? Don't be a fool, Marty. She's just here to keep house for me. Look at her. She's pregnant by another man. Do you think I'd waste money on buying her grand things?" He looked at her scornfully before turning back to Marty. "We're not even married yet, but it's none of your business anyway." John's hands clenched into fists by his side at Ray's cruel words. He hated the way the man looked at Hazel so dismissively, and even though he avoided violence wherever possible when it came to Hazel's honor, he wanted to wipe the smirk off Ray's face. "What else have you got in that shack of yours that belongs to me?" Marty demanded, determined to keep Ray jumping to his tune. He stepped closer and suddenly flicked his coat back and pulled his gun in one smooth movement. "I reckon I'll take a look around and see for myself whether you're telling the truth. If you come one step closer, you'll be meeting your maker quicker than expected." Ray reached behind his back and whipped his own gun out from where it had been tucked in his belt. The two men stood eyeing each other, waiting to see who would make the first move. Suddenly, Ray's dog bounded out of the shack and ran toward Marty. His hackles were up, and John could hear a low, deep growl coming from his chest. Despite years of bad treatment, the dog was ready to defend his master. "No, come back, Bruno. Here, there's a good boy. Come to me." Hazel ran down the steps toward the dog, thinking nothing of her own safety. The dog stopped and whined, looking between Hazel and Ray in confusion. "Get that mangy creature away from me before I shoot it," Marty said coldly. He raised his gun, taking aim at the dog, which was crawling back to Hazel on its belly. John scrambled over the fence and ran toward them as fast as he could. "Don't shoot! Hazel! Get out of the way!" Before he could reach her, a shot rang out and Hazel crumpled to the ground. Chapter 9. The baby. Hazel tried to push herself upright and shook her head, feeling disoriented. "You and the baby are safe. You fainted, but I managed to break your fall." Hazel blinked at the sound of the warm, caring voice as her eyes slowly came into focus again. John was looking down at her with such a caring expression that she knew everything would be okay. He was kneeling on the dirt next to her, and he carefully put his arm under her shoulders and helped her sit up. "What happened? The last thing I can remember is seeing Marty's gun right in front of me." Suddenly, Hazel remembered something else. "How's the poor dog? Please tell me Marty didn't shoot Bruno?" At the sound of his name, a wet nose nudged Hazel's hand, and she smiled as she saw the dog standing next to her, wagging his tail ecstatically. "Marty didn't shoot the dog, but I'm afraid he has shot Ray." John helped Hazel to her feet, holding her tight until she was no longer feeling dizzy. There was a guttural groan from the veranda behind them. "That low-down snake shot me. Pass me my gun, Hazel. I'll show him." Ray's words came out in jagged gasps, and he groaned again. "Hurry up, woman. What are you waiting for? There's no time to lose." Hazel felt terror clutching at her chest again and spun around, looking wildly across the darkening landscape. It felt as though every bush or shadow contained danger as she felt her baby kick. "Don't worry," John said quickly. Marty didn't wait to find out whether Ray was dead or alive. He galloped away. He shook his head as he looked toward Ray. "I think you've just gotten a flesh wound, but you should know that Marty swore that he would get his revenge on you sooner or later before he left. I'm not afraid of him." Ray tried to sit up but didn't have the strength to and collapsed back onto the wooden boards with a grunt of frustration. "What are we going to do?" Hazel asked, turning toward John for his advice. Should we go and fetch the doctor? What about the sheriff? No, Ray practically shouted. No doctor, and definitely not Sheriff Jackson. You'll look after me, won't you, Hazel? He pleaded. I guess I could. As much as Hazel wanted to walk away from Ray and have nothing more to do with him, she knew she couldn't just leave him to suffer. She felt a sense of obligation toward him, even though they weren't yet married, simply because he had paid for her to come out west. Perhaps it's better that we aren't married. The thought slid into her mind, and she tucked it away, knowing that she would need to consider it more in her own time. Did she really want to be married to a man who had just been accused of being a thief? She was quickly realizing that there was a lot about Ray Manning she didn't know, and she wasn't sure whether she wanted to stick around to find out any more of his dark secrets. If you're determined to stay, I'll help you get Ray into bed, John offered. Let me just run back to my house and fetch some bandages and tell the children where I am in case they're worried. They might have heard the gunshot. Hazel filled a bucket with water from the pump and stoked the small stove inside the shack to get some water boiling. John was back within minutes, and together they managed to lift Ray up and maneuver him into the shack. There was an old wooden bedstead in the back room behind a sagging curtain. The mattress was lumpy, and the blankets were threadbare, but it was the only bed in the place, so it would have to do. I sure could use some whiskey, Ray mumbled as Hazel unbuttoned his shirt with trembling fingers. I think you've had quite enough to drink today already, John said firmly. Let me just see how bad the wound is. Hazel peeled just enough of the shirt back to get a better look and brought the lamp closer. The muscles on his chest had long since turned to flab through idleness, and she pressed her lips together in distaste, trying to hide the fact that she knew she would never want to share a bed with Ray. John handed Hazel some clean rags, which she dunked into a bowl of hot water and used to carefully clean the blood away. It looked like Marty hadn't intended to kill Ray, just teach him a lesson. The bullet had gone into his shoulder, but once Hazel had wiped the oozing blood away, the wound didn't look too bad. Do you think the bullet is still in there? She asked John quietly, stepping away from the bed. What if it gets infected? I guess I could ask Dr. Mundy to call in tomorrow, John said in a low voice. I can hear what you're saying, Ray muttered. Just leave us alone, John. I don't want you interfering and fussing over me. I'm not one of your children. He suddenly rolled himself off the bed and grabbed the door of his nightstand, wrenching it open. A full bottle of whiskey rolled out, and he snatched it up, pulling the stopper out with his teeth before gulping it down before Hazel could stop him. If we agree to leave it a couple of days to see if it gets better, will you stop behaving like a fool? John growled. And one more thing, I'm not leaving Hazel here alone in this shack at night. It's not safe. Marty could come back at any time. Ray regarded them both blearily and then grinned as the whiskey started to take effect. Hazel and I have a secret now, he said with a drunken chuckle. She knows I've been stealing things, don't you, my dear? I've even got a few items hidden away, which might make me a wealthy man one day. He grinned again and hiccuped loudly, tucking the whiskey bottle into his arm like an infant that needed protecting. So what Marty accused you of is right? Hazel asked. She felt a sense of bitter disappointment at how much Ray had deceived her. Nothing that you wrote in your letters was true, was it? She added quietly. Maybe, maybe not. Marty smirked at her, and his gaze lingered on her belly. You can't be too choosy if you expect me to raise another man's child. There was a sheen of sweat on his brow now, and his head fell back on the pillow. Do you think that wretched pastor has gotten back from the funeral yet? He muttered. John strode toward the bed and leaned over it, glaring at Ray. You can put any ideas of marriage out of your mind for now. It sounds like you invited Miss Anderson out here under false pretenses, so it's only right that you should give her time to consider whether she wants to go ahead with the wedding. Ray blinked owlishly as he tried to take in what John was saying. I suppose you think you can offer her something better, huh? Go ahead then, he added scornfully. I reckon there's more to her story than she's letting on. Since she arrived, she ain't even mentioned her so-called husband, who supposedly died, leaving her a widow. So if you want to take on a fallen woman, be my guest." He took another swig of whiskey and sighed. "Hazel owes me some time and attention in return for the cost of her rail fare, so she can nurse me until I'm well again, and then I'll decide." Hazel felt a wave of relief at the thought that her wedding to Ray had been postponed. Even if it was just for a few days, it gave her a chance to think about her options or whether she could find work to support herself and the baby. Quite frankly, she didn't care where she went as long as she didn't have to marry him. "I think it's time for you to get some sleep." She prized the bottle out of his hands and was pleased to see that he was already dozing. John beckoned her out to the veranda. "Would you consider staying at my house, Miss Anderson?" he asked. "I don't want to put you in a compromising situation, but you are welcome to stay in the house with the children. Miss Bell, my housekeeper, comes to our house every day, and I am more than happy to sleep out in the barn at night for as long as you need to stay with us." Hazel looked up into his blue eyes, wondering if she could trust him. She had been lied to so many times that it was hard to know who had her best interests at heart anymore. "I'm not sure I can accept, Mr. Fisher. It wouldn't be right for you to sleep in the barn like an animal. It's very comfortable, so don't say no on account of that," John replied with a low chuckle. "I call it the barn, but it was where Zoe and I lived when we first moved onto this land while I was building the log cabin. I have a bed above the stables in the hayloft. The children like to play house up there when Mrs. Bell lets them." Hazel felt her resolve weakening. She didn't have much money left to pay for the Rosebush Inn, but she certainly didn't want to be left alone with Ray in the shack during the night. "You'd be doing me a favor," John continued casually. "Mrs. Bell's arthritis ain't so good in this cold weather, and the children can be a handful for someone her age. I'm dreading that she might decide not to be our housekeeper anymore. But if you could help out around the house, maybe that would be a compromise that would sit better with you." "That's very kind of you. I do feel I should at least make sure that Ray's wound heals all right." Hazel was suddenly overwhelmed with exhaustion, and she clutched the rail to steady herself. So much had happened in such a short space of time, she felt as though she could barely keep up with it all, let alone make decisions that would affect the rest of her life. Without show or fanfare, John gently took her hand and tucked it into the crook of his arm. "Ray will probably sleep like the dead until daybreak after the amount of whiskey he's had to drink today. And you need a good night's rest, Miss Anderson. Everything else can wait, don't you think?" "I'm so glad you're Ray's neighbor," Hazel said wearily. She leaned on John as they walked toward the welcoming sight of a lamp in the window of his log cabin, and all she could think about was how wonderful it would be to drift off to sleep, knowing that John wouldn't allow anything bad to happen to her. The following morning, the soft glow of the low fall sun filtered through the window and cast splashes of color where it fell on the rag rug on the floorboards. Hazel slowly blinked, awake, becoming aware of muffled whispers. "It's the pretty lady from next door. Do you think she's here to look after us instead of Mrs. Bell? I sure do hope so." Hazel was suddenly wide awake, and she sat up to see Emily and Reuben peeking around the door at her. "Good morning," she said, pulling the covers up to her shoulders. "There was some trouble at Mr. Manning's shack yesterday, so your pa kindly offered for me to sleep here for a few nights." "Children, what are you doing disturbing our guest? Miss Anderson needs to rest." John sounded equal parts exasperated and embarrassed. "Would you like me to bring you a cup of coffee?" he asked politely from the hallway. Hazel smiled to herself as she heard him shooing the children away, telling them that they had better get dressed quickly before Mrs. Bell arrived. "That's a very kind offer, but no, thank you. If anything, it should be me offering to make breakfast for you. I think I must have been more tired than I thought, and I fear I've overslept, but I'll be through to the kitchen in just a moment." "It's important for the baby that you take things easy. I'm glad you slept well." By the time Hazel had hastily washed her face, brushed her hair and twisted it up and secured it with pins, and gotten dressed, She could already hear Mrs. Bell clattering pots and pans in the kitchen. She hoped that John would have explained her presence, not wanting to shock the old woman by suddenly appearing. "Sit at the table and behave yourselves," Mrs. Bell snapped. "Would you like me to take care of making breakfast?" Hazel asked hesitantly from the doorway. "I'm just staying here for a few days while Mr. Manning recovers." Mrs. Bell turned from the stove and eyed Hazel warily. "I'm not sure what to think about this setup," she muttered with a disapproving sniff. "It's bad enough with the children running wild, let alone finding a strange woman in the kitchen." She stirred the porridge for a moment with a stubborn expression while Hazel hovered awkwardly, wondering what to say to put her mind at rest. But a moment later, her curiosity got the better of her. "What's happened to Mr. Manning?" she asked in a low voice. "I never liked the man. I reckon it was something shady, huh?" Hazel joined Mrs. Bell at the range and started to make coffee. She glanced over her shoulder, but the children were busy reading, so it seemed safe to talk. "As you know, I only arrived a few days ago, and I've never met any of Ray's acquaintances, but a man called Marty Hawkins showed up, and they had an argument about some stolen items," she explained quietly. "It got out of hand, and Marty shot him in the shoulder. Ray expects me to take care of him, but Mr. Fisher felt that it wasn't safe for me to stay at the shack in case Marty came back again to do worse." She felt her cheeks reddening. "We were meant to get married today, but—" She didn't finish, letting Mrs. Bell draw her own conclusions. "Thieving, huh? Well, I can't say I'm surprised to hear that Ray Manning has gotten himself tangled up with an unsavory character like Marty," Mrs. Bell said. "They're both as bad as each other. Never done an honest day's work between them. It's come as a bit of a shock. Ray described himself as a successful businessman in his letters." Hazel shook her head, still finding it hard to believe that she had been duped again. Mrs. Bell patted her arm in a sudden gesture of kindness. "Don't go thinking that you'll ever be able to change Ray. He's a weak, lazy man, and you're better off without him." There was a motherly glint of concern in her eyes, which Hazel found touching. "Why don't you sit by the fire for a while and let me make breakfast?" Hazel said. It was nice to find another ally so far from home. "My ma used to suffer from arthritis during the winter, and I know how much pain it can cause. Besides, I told Mr. Fisher that I could only accept his kind hospitality if you let me help out with the chores." Mrs. Bell hesitated for a moment and then gave Hazel a warm smile. And Hazel could see that the old woman had a kind heart beneath her gruff exterior. "Maybe 10 minutes by the fire will help. I can't seem to warm up today," she said, hobbling over to the armchair and rubbing her painful fingers. She sank into it and held her hands toward the flames with a grateful sigh. "I raised my children alone after I was widowed, but they've all moved to other parts of Wyoming and have families of their own now. I think I underestimated how lively Mr. Fisher's children would be when I agreed to become his housekeeper. You forget how much energy they have at that age," she added with a rueful smile. "It's good to have a younger woman around the house. You're just what this family needs." Hazel hummed as she bustled around the kitchen, preparing breakfast, wishing that it had been a man like John, whose advertisement she had replied to, instead of Ray. There was something about the cozy kitchen and seeing John chopping logs out by the barn as Emily and Reuben tucked into their food that made her feel like she'd finally arrived somewhere she could happily settle and call home. "Don't think like that," Hazel sighed. She couldn't risk getting too attached to the Fisher family, not when the man who was meant to be her husband was languishing in the decrepit shack next door, nursing a hangover and a gunshot wound caused by his law-breaking ways. Chapter 10. Hazel felt the by now familiar sense of dread in her chest as she paused at the boundary between John's property and Ray's. John had thoughtfully put a gateway in the fence to make it easier for her to get between his house and Ray's shack, and she stood there for a moment, gazing toward the mountains, trying to let their beauty bring her some peace. 2 weeks had already passed since Marty had unleashed violence on them, and the trees on the lower slopes of the mountains were ablaze with the orange and red colors of fall. Mrs. Bell had lent her a thick woolen shawl, which she was grateful for in the brisk north wind. John had told her that it was likely they would get snow in the next few days, and the turning seasons reflected the unrest in her mind. "Dear Lord, forgive me my sins, and grant me the patience to care for Ray and help him get better," she said softly. "I know it's wrong to find someone lacking, but I don't know the right thing to do about Ray, knowing that he has broken the law and stolen from hardworking people. I pray that I may see a way to do what's right and be able to raise my baby in your righteous path, Lord." She waited for another moment to allow her mood to lift from the sense of peace she always got from her faith, and a moment later, Bruno came bounding toward her, wagging his tail, which made her smile. It was as if the dog was showing her that she could be happy regardless of how bad things were. "You're a good boy, Bruno," she said. Under her care, he had filled out, and his coat was starting to look glossier than it had been. Ray insisted the dog stayed with him at the shack, but it was clear who Bruno now considered his owner. He looked up at Hazel with bright eyes before pouncing on a leaf playfully. "I wish I could take you back to John's place at night," Hazel murmured. She stroked the dog's soft head and took a deep breath before walking purposefully toward the shack. "And I wish I knew what my future holds," she added wistfully. "You're late!" Ray glared at her from the ramshackle veranda, rasping his hand over his straggly beard. "How am I supposed to get better if you waste your time gazing at the views? I don't have time for that sort of nonsense. Make me a cooked breakfast and get on with the laundry in case it starts snowing." "Would you like bacon and eggs or porridge?" Hazel asked, ignoring his attempts to spoil her day and control her every movement. "It looks like you have a bit more color in your cheeks today," she added, squeezing past him. His only reply was a reluctant grunt, and he rubbed his shoulder, which was still bandaged. The shack was now clean and tidy inside, even if all the furniture had seen better days. It was clear that Ray took no pride in his home, his land, or his animals. Although Hazel had been raised to try and see the best in people, it was hard where Ray was concerned. She reluctantly realized that it was true what Mrs. Bell had said. Ray was an idle layabout, quick to put other folks down without ever thinking that he himself could do better. Ray slumped moodily into the rocking chair on the veranda. "I'll have bacon and eggs and a new pot of coffee and be quick about it." He kicked out at Bruno as the dog tried to follow Hazel into the shack, scowling when the dog managed to swerve his boot. "You're spoiling this mangy creature," he grumbled. "He isn't as obedient as he used to be, and you know I like all my animals to do as I tell them, including you, Hazel," he muttered to himself, with a sly grin at his own wit. Hazel managed to get most of her jobs done without speaking to Ray. She had quickly learned that there was no keeping him happy. Whatever she did, he found a way to criticize it. Whether she was too slow or too extravagant with his meager supplies of food, or just did something in a way that seemed not to meet with his approval, Ray's moods and criticisms hung over the shack like a dark storm cloud, draining the pleasure from everything. "I've made you a fruitcake to go with your coffee," Hazel said later that afternoon. She looked towards the washing line, where the bed sheets were almost dry. "I just need to fetch the sheets in and hang them over the stove to air, and then I'll make your bed for you." She put the coffee and cake on the table next to his rocking chair on the veranda where he had been sitting for the last hour. "Would you rather have this here or inside by the fire?" Ray jumped up and paced back and forth. He seemed increasingly nervous and agitated with each new day since his argument with Marty. "Have you seen anyone passing on the road today?" he demanded. "I guess I nodded off there for a little while, and I like to know who's around." She wondered whether it was worth mentioning that if he drank less whiskey, he might be able to stay awake, but figured there was no point. "I've seen a few people go past," she replied. "A couple of families with wagons, fetching supplies by the look of it, and also gentlemen riding past on their horses alone. Are you expecting anyone?" Ray's head snapped around at the final part of her reply. "Gentlemen? Strangers or people from town?" He strode towards Hazel and gripped her arm painfully. "Tell me the truth, woman. Don't try and deceive me. Who were they?" Hazel gasped and pulled her arm away, wondering whether she should shout for help. "I'm sorry, I don't recognize folks yet, Ray. They were just gentlemen going about their business. Useless, he muttered angrily. His dark eyes were cold with contempt for her, and he resumed his pacing, gazing nervously across his scrubby paddocks toward the road. "What if Mr. Smith comes back?" he mumbled to himself. He paused and wolfed down a few mouthfuls of cake, followed by a gulp of coffee. "And Marty? I haven't seen the last of him, I'm sure of it." "I don't think any of the people passing looked like Marty," Hazel said hastily, trying to reassure him. "Perhaps, if you would let me speak to Sheriff Jackson about the shooting, you would have more peace of mind. Surely it's better that the sheriff knows what Mr. Hawkins did to you." Ray's fist thumped down onto the table, making her jump and slopping coffee over the edge of his mug. "What have I told you?" he snapped. "This is none of your business, Hazel, and if you get the law involved, I'll make sure you regret it." Bruno's lip curled in a snarl at Ray's violent outburst, and his hackles went up. She saw Ray's fingers twitch toward the gun, which he now kept near him at all times. "Hush now, boy, it's all right," Hazel said softly. She gave Ray a long look, lifting her chin definitely. "I'm just trying to help you, Ray. What sort of life is it if you're worried about every person riding past? I'm going to fetch the sheets now. Come, Bruno. Come with me." The last thing she wanted was for him to shoot the dog, in a fit of rage that Bruno had switched allegiance to her and was trying to protect her from his anger. Ray's moods seemed to be getting more unpredictable with each passing hour, and she didn't know how much longer she could take it. By the time she got back to the shack with the freshly washed sheets folded in her basket, Ray's mood had changed again. She noticed the half-empty whiskey bottle under his chair and figured that was why. "I deserve better than this?" Ray said, gesturing at his land with a disappointed expression. "I've never really liked it here, and I reckon if it weren't for having to split my profits with Marty, I could make a fortune. I just have to find somewhere new, away from him." He chuckled and nodded as if the answer was obvious. "It's Marty's fault. He's been holding me back, Hazel, insisting he's the one in charge. But I can see now that I was the one doing all the dirty work. I need to start over, and this time I'll keep all the money for myself. I'll be a wealthy man soon enough." Hazel's heart sank. Although they hadn't discussed marriage again since he had been shot, she was gripped by a sudden fear that Ray might insist on them getting wed and then take her somewhere far away. Somewhere they wouldn't know anybody. The thought was so awful that she started to feel breathless with worry and clutched her belly, rubbing it to soothe herself and the baby. "I'll make your bed and put your stew in a bowl for you to have later," she said faintly. "I'm feeling a little unwell from the baby, so I'll leave after that and see you tomorrow morning." Before Ray could reply, a man on horseback appeared in the distance. The horse was practically galloping, and Ray snatched up his gun, nodding absent-mindedly. "Tomorrow? See you then." He shaded his eyes against the setting sun, trying to see who the rider was, but it was impossible to make out, and his face contorted with a mixture of anger and frustration. "Gotta hide!" He staggered down the steps and stumbled into the shadows at the side of his shack. "Is it Marty? Has he come back to get even with me?" he croaked. "I'm never going to get away from him unless I go somewhere new," he mumbled fretfully to himself. Hazel waited until the man had ridden past, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew now with crystal clarity that if she stayed with Ray, they would always be looking over their shoulders, running from whoever he had crossed. He was the sort of man who would make enemies wherever they went, whether it was Marty or other men like him. He didn't have it within him to live an honest life, and that wasn't how she wanted to raise her baby. "I just need to figure out a way to leave him without endangering myself or John and his family," she thought to herself as she quickly tucked the sheets over his bed and ladled out some stew. Ray was stubborn and would always blame someone else for the misfortune he had brought upon himself. Walking away from him was the right thing to do, but Hazel knew he would be angry, very angry. "Will you read us just one more part of the story?" Emily asked sleepily. "Please, Miss Anderson. We love it when you read us a bedtime story." Reuben stifled a yawn, his eyelids already getting heavy as Hazel tucked the patchwork quilt over the two children. "I'll read more to you tomorrow," she said softly. She blew out the night candle and stood up, ready to leave the bedroom. "I hope you live with us forever," Emily whispered. Her words were so faint, Hazel wondered for a moment whether she had misheard. "I don't ever want you to leave," Emily added. Hazel brushed a lock of the little girl's dark hair back and leaned over to give her a kiss on her forehead. "I don't ever want to leave either," she thought to herself. As she crept out of the room, she was startled to see John's silhouette in the doorway. "I hope you didn't mind putting them to bed?" he asked. "I noticed a few things have been moved around in the barn. I reckon it was probably just the children playing out there, but I wanted to make sure that everything was locked up properly. The dogs usually bark if there are strangers around, and I didn't hear anything, but I figured it was best to double-check everything to be on the safe side." Hazel couldn't help but shiver. Even though she felt quite safe in John's log cabin, she would never forget the casual way Marty Hawkins had pointed his gun at her, as if her life or death was of no consequence to him. "Don't worry," John added hastily, seeing her fear. "I'm a light sleeper, and I can be back at the house within seconds if something happens during the night." "I know. I just remember the shooting more often than I'd like. I expect it's just having the baby makes me feel worried, even when there's no need. Would you like me to make you a cup of coffee before you go outside again?" Hazel asked. She found herself wishing that John would stay inside and chat with her for a bit longer, but Mrs. Bell had already left, and she knew he was too gentlemanly to do anything which might seem improper. "We could sit out on the veranda for a few minutes. I'm not quite ready to go to sleep yet." John hesitated for a moment and then nodded. "I'd like that very much," he replied. He fetched a thick blanket, and by the time Hazel had brought 2 cups of coffee outside, he had laid it on one of the seats for her, so she wouldn't get cold. It was a clear, starlit night, and Hazel started to feel her worries melt away. What would it be like to sit with John talking about our day when we're old and gray? I wish... Hazel pushed the thought away, telling herself it was a fanciful idea. John's hospitality was just out of kindness, not because he had any romantic feelings toward her. "We might see a shooting star when the sky is like this. My ma used to tell me to make a wish if I saw one, and now I tell it to my children, too," John said conversationally as he watched the steam rising from his cup and then took an appreciative sip of his coffee. He gave her a sideways glance that was hard to read. "About what Emily said, the children have changed so much since you've been here. You're very good with children, Hazel. You'll make a wonderful mother to your little one." Hazel looked up at the sky to avoid his gaze. She could feel a blush creeping up her cheeks and wondered if he knew how much she wished she could stay living with them. With him. "It's kind of you to say so. It might stand me in good stead if I ever have to earn a living. I wanted to be a teacher when I was younger, but Pa expected me to stay at home and raise the boys after Ma died." "What do you mean if you ever have to earn a living?" John leaned forward, and for one moment she thought she was about to take her hand in his. "Have you decided what you might do once Ray gets better?" he asked, suddenly changing the subject. "I'm not sure." Hazel was hesitant about how much to tell John. He had been so kind in offering her a place to stay, but she still felt a sense of obligation toward Ray because of the money he had paid for her to travel west, even though she was sure she had almost done enough in chores around his shack to have paid it off. John had already done so much to help her, but he had his own life to lead. The day she had first arrived, Mrs. Bell had mentioned in passing that John had placed an advertisement looking for a mail-order bride a few months ago. The fact that John had never mentioned it made her wonder whether he was already writing to someone, but didn't want her to feel awkward about it. He was an honorable man, but also rather private, and Hazel knew it was not her place to pry. He mentioned something about moving to a different area so he could get away from Marty, Hazel said lightly. "If he can't get work, I was wondering if I could get a job as a teacher, although I'm not sure who would take care of the baby." "Ray wants to leave Rocky River?" "He can't take you with him. It wouldn't be safe." John sounded shocked, and he glanced toward Ray's shack in the darkness. "He only ever thinks of himself. You need a proper home for when you have the baby, not to be running from one town to the next, or even worse, living out in the woods, fretting about Marty catching up with you. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. He hasn't mentioned marriage again, and I think he's having second thoughts about raising another man's child. Hazel felt touched by how protective John sounded. Of course, he would know how tiring a new baby could be. He had helped raise two already. Something about the darkness and stars above them felt strangely intimate. It was on the tip of Hazel's tongue to confide in John about the fact that she wasn't really a widow, but she couldn't quite bring herself to utter the words. Her thoughts about John swirled. I don't want him to look at me in disgust or think less of me. The realization pulsed through her mind, making her breath catch in her throat as she finally admitted something to herself. I love him, and I can't bear that he might not feel the same way, especially when he knows that I was deceived and the baby was conceived out of wedlock. He'll think I'm a fallen woman, just like Pa and Ray said. Are you okay? It's been a long day. You look exhausted. John's concern almost brought tears to her eyes. It was in such stark contrast to the way Ray treated her. Yes, there's just a lot on my mind. She stood up and reached for the empty coffee cups. Thank you for your company, but I won't keep you. I expect you're tired. John opened the door for her, but as she passed, he reached out and rested his hand lightly on her arm. She could feel the heat from his hand through her sleeve, and her pulse quickened. I know you feel you're indebted to me, he said, but really, it's me who should be thanking you, Hazel. The children have been so much happier since you came to stay with us. He bit his lip and then gave her a small smile, which made her heart beat faster again. And I have too, he added softly. I hadn't realized how lonesome I'd gotten since losing Zoe. Having you here has reminded me what it's like to laugh again. His words hung between them, laden with longing. Hazel wished she could stand within the protective circle of his strong arms and feel his lips on hers, but it would be wrong. Not because of Ray, but because she hadn't yet found the courage to tell him the truth about her baby. I'm glad I've been able to help the children a little. She felt the blood rush to her cheeks again at how close they were standing, fighting the urge to rest her hands against his broad chest. I won't intrude on you for much longer, I promise. Ray seems to be getting restless, so I will have to make a decision about my future in the next few days. You can stay for as long as you need. She smiled up into his kind blue eyes, wishing she could stay with him forever. In spite of everything to do with Ray, this has been one of the happiest times of my life as well, she admitted. I have thanked God many times that you are his neighbor, but there are things about me that I haven't told you. Before her emotions ran away with her, Hazel lowered her eyes and hurried away. There was so much more she wanted to say, but she was terrified of making another mistake. She had to put her baby first, even if it meant she couldn't confess her love for John. A kind-hearted man like him would never want to take on a woman bearing an illegitimate child. By concealing the truth, she was no better than Ray, she thought sadly, and John and his children deserved better than that. The following morning, after a sleepless night, Hazel went across to Ray's shack earlier than usual. She had tossed and turned for hours, praying for guidance and trying to think what would be the best thing for her to do for her baby. Finally, just as the first rays of the morning sun had crept over the mountaintops, she knew what she had to do. She took a deep breath and walked slowly up the steps, pushing the shack's door open. The hinges needed oiling, and it creaked under her hand. I need to speak with you, Ray, she said quickly before her courage failed her. I've decided that I can't marry you, and I won't come with you. I don't care how hard it is to raise my baby alone. I'd rather do that than be with an unfeeling man like you who thinks nothing of stealing from other folks. Her words trailed off as she realized something about the shack was very wrong. She had left plenty of wood by the hearth, but the fire had gone out. She put her hand on the top of the stove. It was also cold to the touch, and she shivered as the wind whistled through the cracks in the walls. As her eyes adjusted to the gloomy interior, she gasped. It looked as though the place had been ransacked. The cupboard doors were open, with dishes and clothes littering the floor, and then she noticed that there was a scrawled letter on the table, held in place by the tip of a hunting knife that had been jammed into the wood. She prized the scrap of paper free and held it up to the window. "Dear Hazel, I've left, and I'm never coming back. You'll only slow me down, and I don't want anything more to do with you and your baby. The land is practically worthless, so don't think you can sell it to make a profit. Maybe that fool next door will try and buy it. He knows where the deeds will be. If I was staying, I could have made a few dollars from it, but it's time for me to make my fortune elsewhere. Don't try to find me. Ray." Chapter 12. Hazel skimmed the words and then read them out loud, struggling to comprehend them. Suddenly, she noticed Bruno cowering under the bed. "What is it, boy?" At the sound of Hazel's kind voice, the dog limped toward her, and tears pooled in her eyes. It looked like Ray had beaten the poor creature on his way out, and she felt anger swell in her chest. "I promise nobody will ever hurt you again, Bruno," she said, burying her face in his thick fur. She read Ray's short letter again, starting to make sense of it. The shack hadn't been ransacked. Ray had just grabbed what he needed in a hurry, not caring what state he left the place in. She ran back out onto the veranda and saw that his horse and rickety wagon weren't there. "He's gone, Bruno. We're finally free of him." This time, Hazel was practically running as she headed back toward John's house with Bruno by her heels. "Goodness me, what's gotten into you?" Mrs. Bell asked, looking startled as Hazel burst into the log cabin. "You look like you've had a shock or something." She frowned as she caught sight of the dog. Emily and Reuben jumped down from their chairs, where they were eating breakfast at the table, and ran toward her. "Did Mr. Manning hurt you?" Emily cried. "You have tears on your cheeks, and Bruno is never normally allowed to leave his property." At the sound of all the commotion, John came running over from the barn and took the veranda steps 2 at a time. "Hazel, are you all right? I saw you rushing back from the shack. What's happened?" Hazel took a shaky breath and smiled around at the people she had grown to love. "Ray has left," she said breathlessly, holding up his letter. "He's packed up and gone, and he's told me not to try to look for him. He's never coming back again." She waited to feel some sort of regret that she had been abandoned, but all she felt was relief flooding through her. Maybe somewhere beneath Ray's rough ways and cruel demeanor, there was a nicer man, but she hadn't seen a glimpse of it in the time they had spent together. "Is it bad of me to be glad that he's gone?" she asked, looking between Mrs. Bell and John for some reassurance. "I told you you'd be better off without him, and I meant it," Mrs. Bell said firmly. "Men like him don't change. Now, come and sit back at the table, children, and give Miss Anderson a chance to get accustomed to her news." She gave John a straight look and raised her eyebrows, as though expecting him to do something. "Mrs. Bell is quite right," John said hastily, "but I'm sure it has still come as a shock." He paused for a moment, looking as though he wanted to say more, but then pressed his lips together to stop himself. "That means you can spend more time with us now," Reuben said happily before taking a big bite out of his bread and jam. "Hush, Reuben," Emily scolded. "It's up to Miss Anderson to decide what she wants to do now." Hazel turned away and walked toward the window to look out at the view that she had so enjoyed these last few weeks. "What will I do now? There's no reason for me to stay here with John and his family now that Ray has left." The thought felt like being doused with a bucket of cold water after her initial sense of relief about Ray going. Hazel realized that now she really would have to make some difficult decisions. "I think it would be best if I stayed at the Rosebush Inn for a few nights," she said quietly. "I expect I should write to my family back in Boston and tell them what has happened. And I might call in at the school to see if there are any jobs available or ask around at some of the other businesses in town." The baby suddenly kicked, and she pressed her hand to her belly. It was a stark reminder that even if she managed to find work and somewhere to stay, it would all come to an end when she had the baby to look after. Mrs. Bell coughed loudly and gave John another hard stare. "My arthritis has been playing up something terrible these last few days," she muttered under her breath. "It's almost too much for me to bear." "Would you be able to take me into town later today?" Hazel asked John. "It won't take me long to pack." A sudden thought occurred to her. What about Bruno? Would he be able to stay with you? I know you'll look after him and give him the sort of home he needs. Ray said in his letter that the land is practically worthless, or maybe you might like to have it. She felt a wave of sorrow as Bruno looked up at her with his trusting brown eyes, but she couldn't take the dog with her. He belonged out on a ranch, not in town. And then she caught sight of Emily, who was trying hard not to cry at the mention of her leaving. A torrent of emotions swept over her, and she hurried back outside again to get some air. Hazel, can I talk to you? John's voice was soft behind her, and she realized he had followed her out to the veranda. She turned to face him, seeing a mixture of hope and something else she couldn't quite describe on his face. He stepped closer and took both of her hands in his. I've wanted to tell you so many times, but I knew it wouldn't be right while you were still visiting Ray. Tell me what? Hazel looked up into his bright blue eyes and saw something new in them. I love you, Hazel, John said simply. He shook his head with a wry smile as though he could scarcely believe he was uttering the words. Watching you walking next door to take care of Ray every morning, knowing how badly he was treating you, was the hardest thing I've had to do in a long time. But I know you wanted to honor the fact that he had paid for you to come to Wyoming to be his wife. Now that he's gone, I know I'll regret it forever if I don't tell you how much I've come to feel for you. I love you. Hazel blinked. It was as if everything she had prayed for was coming true. You love me? She whispered. She glanced down at her belly. Even with the baby, your baby, John said. He rested his hand on her waist and smiled as they both felt a nudge from the baby's heel. I love you and the baby, and I want to take care of you both forever. Will you marry me, Hazel? Suddenly, she came to her senses. She pulled back from his embrace, already feeling the cold chill where his warm hands had held her a moment before. I want to say yes, John, but I can't. Not until you know the truth. Hazel took a deep breath, knowing how important her next words would be. I'm not a widow. Not really. I thought I was married to a gentleman called Zachary, but it turned out he was already married. He had a wife and 2 children and was leading a double life. I only found out when he stole some money from Pa and then was killed over an unpaid debt. She looked at John, expecting to see revulsion at her admission, but he just gave her an encouraging nod to continue. Pa told me I had to pretend the marriage was legitimate. He replied to Ray's advertisement, saying I was a widow. But once I got here, I couldn't pretend to use Zachary's surname, so I reverted to Anderson, my family name. I think Ray suspected something was wrong. She felt the weight of her lies falling away and sighed with relief. Even if John was put off by what she had just revealed, she would know she had done the right thing at last. None of that matters, Hazel, John declared. He pulled her into his arms and lowered his head to look into her eyes, his gaze full of sympathy. You have been badly treated by 2 men through no fault of your own, but now I want to take care of you, my love. Emily and Reuben adore you. I never thought I would be lucky enough to fall in love twice in my lifetime, but the Lord brought you here to us, and I do love you, Hazel. Will you marry me? This time, Hazel turned her face up toward his and smiled as she felt her heart overflowing with joy. Yes, John, I love you too, and I prayed that there might be a way we could be together. You're everything I ever wished for in a husband and more. Her next few words were silenced as John's lips met hers in a tender kiss. He cradled her face and kissed her again. I'm truly blessed to have you, and I can't wait for us to welcome a new baby into the world soon. Hazel leaned against his broad chest with a happy sigh. Her journey to Wyoming had started in lies and desperation, but now she had a happy future to look forward to, with John, Emily, and Reuben by her side. Did they kiss? Are they in love? Emily and Reuben's muffled whispers reached them from the doorway, and Hazel and John exchanged a smile as they heard Mrs. Bell happily declare that instead of doing chores and schoolwork, the children would be helping her bake a wedding cake for the rest of the day. Epilogue. The following year. Hazel looked down into her daughter's face, which peeked out from the shawl wrapped around her as she lay in her arms. Eve was already over a month old, and Hazel couldn't believe how much joy the tiny bundle of innocence had brought her. She rocked contentedly in the rocking chair on the veranda, enjoying the warmth of the spring sunshine on her face. "The mailman delivered a letter for you," Emily called. She and Reuben had been in the front paddock, feeding the chickens, and their cheeks were rosy as they raced each other back to the log cabin. Hazel had seen the mailman halt his horse at the end of the drive, but she hadn't expected the letter to be for her. She felt her spirits lift and sat up straighter, praying it would be from the person she most hoped for. "Shall I hold Eve for you?" John asked, strolling across from the barn. His muscular forearms were dusted with sawdust from the furniture he was carving for a new customer in town, and his expression softened as he came up the steps, just like it did every time he saw his new wife. He was busier than ever with work, but nothing could stop him from spending time with baby Eve. Hazel was struck again by what a kind-hearted man he was. Ever since Pastor Franklin had married them, a week after Ray's unexpected departure, John had been a devoted husband to Hazel. At first, she found herself wondering how long it could last and whether it was too good to be true. But like a nervous colt, learning to trust the person handling it, John had patiently shown Hazel through his small daily actions what true love really looked like. In return, Hazel felt herself starting to blossom, like a flower opening in the sun. Her love for John grew deeper every day, and she couldn't imagine life without him. Or Emily, Reuben, and now Eve. It was everything she had ever prayed and hoped for. Hazel stood up carefully so as not to wake the baby and placed Eve in the crook of John's arm. Emily and Reuben hovered nearby, eager to help out with their baby sister. "I hope you're being quiet, children," Mrs. Bell whispered loudly as she came out onto the veranda with 2 cups and a pot of coffee. "Baby Eve needs her sleep. Why don't you come and help me set the table, Emily? And I expect you'd like to help your pa with sweeping up the sawdust, Reuben?" Mrs. Bell had insisted on coming back to help around the house after the worst of winter had passed, and Hazel had grown close to her, discovering that the old woman's gruffness had been because she was lonely. Now that she was helping out again, she was like the grandma they'd never had, and she hummed happily as she bustled around the kitchen, glad to be part of the expanding family. Hazel opened the letter with mixed emotions. She recognized the handwriting as her father's and wondered what he would say. She had sent several letters home over the last few months. The first one had been to tell her family that Ray had not been the man he had portrayed himself as in his letters, and that although she had nursed him when he was wounded in a gunfight, he had left, and she was marrying Ray's neighbor, John Fisher, instead. Her pa had not replied, and she had buried her hurt, thinking that yet again she had disappointed him in some way. As promised, she sent some small gifts back to the family for Christmas. Laura had sent a card back, but there was still no word from her pa. But then John had gently suggested she should write again after Eve was born. "I think you might just be surprised at how a new life can heal rifts from the past," he had said, holding Hazel and Eve in his arms. So Hazel had taken his advice, describing the soft, downy hair on Eve's head and how alert she seemed, always interested in her surroundings, and now Pa has written back to me. She read the first few lines of the letter and gradually felt a sense of relief and happiness fill her. She hadn't realized how much she had wanted to hear these words until now. Reuben had already scampered away to the barn and was busy sweeping, so Hazel read the letter out to John. "My dearest Hazel, I was delighted to read your wonderful news about Eve's arrival. I'm sure she brings great happiness to you and John, as well as to Emily and Reuben. I feel I owe you an apology for the way I took you for granted, expecting you to do all the chores in our house and raise the boys after your mama died. My grief at losing her clouded my judgment, but since marrying Winifred, she has made me see things differently. I treated you harshly over Zachary's behavior. It was not your fault that he deceived you, and I should have defended you instead of turning you away. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. I don't drink liquor anymore, and we have started going to church more again. I will probably finish working at the bank this summer. Winifred was most taken with how you described your life in Wyoming and what it's like at Rocky River. Laura and the boys have been clamoring for us to visit you ever since your first letter. It seems a shame for us never to meet Eve, So I have been wondering about us all settling out west. There are opportunities for Laura to work as a dressmaker, I believe, and I think life on the frontier would suit Frank and Paul well. So much has happened since we last saw you, Hazel, but now that I have started going back to church again with Winifred, I feel that the Lord would like me to make amends with you and give our family a fresh start out west. Write back and let me know what you think. I value your opinion. With best wishes from your father, Edward. Hazel's eyes blurred with tears of happiness. I never wanted to say anything, but this is exactly what I wished for since we got married, John. I have a new family now, with you and the children, but I wanted Pa to be happy for me as well. I think it's a grand idea for them to come out west, John said. Frank and Paul would love to learn to ride horses and work with cattle, and Laura said when I left that she might like to marry a frontier man in the future. Your Pa was certainly right about how much has changed, John replied with a wry smile. We've taken on more land. Our family is growing. In a strange sort of way, it's all thanks to Ray, Hazel said softly. She stood next to John, and he put his arm protectively around her shoulder before brushing a kiss on her lips. Together they looked toward the boundary fence and beyond. John had followed Ray's suggestion, buying the land for a modest amount as it had been left to rack and ruin. The money was in the bank, should Ray ever return, although Sheriff Jackson had said it was unlikely he would, even though Marty had since been arrested. Under John's care, the land was slowly coming good again. New shoots of fresh spring grass were poking through the soil where he had cleared the brambles. The 2 cows were now sleek and in calf to expand his herd, and the shack had been knocked down, so it would never remind Hazel of what had happened there. I wish Ray well, Hazel continued, but I'm glad he left, so we could be together. Maybe that was the Lord's plan all along, John said lightly, thinking how blessed they were. Baby Eve opened her eyes and yawned, blinking as a soft breeze rustled the unfurling leaves on the oak tree next to the cabin. She waved her arms, and her tiny hands spread like starfish, making Hazel and John smile. I love you, John. Thank you for believing in me, even when nobody else did, and helping me when I needed it most. Hazel leaned her head against his chest, sending up a silent prayer of thanks that the Lord had blessed her with these wonderful people and that her family would soon be joining them out west. I love you too, and I always will. The simplicity of John's words filled Hazel's heart with fresh joy, and she smiled as she watched 2 doves billing and cooing in the oak tree. There were more changes to look forward to in the future, but at that moment, as the sun sparkled on the river in the distance and the land was slowly awakening again in spring, everything was absolutely perfect. The end. Thank you for listening to this free audiobook, and we hope you enjoyed it. Martha Gillcrest writes clean romance stories that sweep you away to when times were simpler, with plenty of love and adventure to entertain you. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like it with a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. That way, you will always know when a new audiobook has been added for your listening pleasure.